Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The studio smelled like decades of cigarette smoke and neglect when I first pushed open the door. My camera bag slung over one shoulder and 3 months' rent clutched in my sweaty palm. The landlord had warned me about the size. Cozy, he'd called it, which I'd learned was realtor speak for barely habitable, but nothing had prepared me for the claustrophobic reality of my new home. 42 square feet. That's what the lease said, though I suspected they'd been generous with their measuring tape. The space contained everything a person might need to exist. A Murphy bed that folded down from the wall, a kitchenette with a hot plate, and a mini fridge that hummed like an angry wasp, and a bathroom so small I had to step sideways to close the door. What struck me most, however, were the mirrors. They were everywhere. The previous tenant, I learned from Mrs. Chen, who lived across the hall, had been a dancer. She'd installed mirrors on every available surface. The back of the front door, the wall opposite the Murphy bed, even a small one positioned above the sink. The effect was dizzying, creating an illusion of space that fooled the eye while trapping it in an endless loop of reflections. I should have taken them down immediately. Should have recognized the way they made my skin crawl every time I caught movement in my peripheral vision. But I was broke, desperate, and foolishly believed I could adapt to anything for $300 a month in Manhattan. The first incident happened during my second week. I was setting up a shot of the tiny window that faced the brick wall of the adjacent building, working on a series I called Urban Isolation, when I noticed him. A man in the mirror behind me, positioned exactly where I should have seen the opposite wall. He was tall, lean, with dark hair that fell across his forehead in a way that suggested he'd run his fingers through it moments before. What unsettled me wasn't his presence, but his posture. He was posing. I stood with my camera raised, finger poised over the shutter, and he mirrored my position perfectly. His hands gripped an invisible camera. His stance matched mine. Even the slight tilt of his head as I composed the shot was replicated with eerie precision. When I lowered my camera to look directly at the mirror, he was gone. Just the empty studio reflected back at me, exactly as it should be. I convinced myself it was stress. Moving to New York, struggling to find work, subsisting on instant ramen and the occasional 20 I earned from tourists who wanted their picture taken in Times Square. It all added up to exhaustion, manifesting in odd ways. The mind played tricks when pushed too hard, created phantoms from shadows and fatigue. But the incidents continued. Every time I raised my camera, he appeared, always in a different mirror, always mimicking my movements with uncanny accuracy. When I crouched low for a ground-level shot, he crouched. When I stretched up to capture the water stains on the ceiling, he stretched. The coordination was so perfect it seemed choreographed, as if we'd rehearsed these movements together for years. What disturbed me most was his face. I never saw it clearly, always turned away, angled down, or obscured by the invisible camera he held. But there was something familiar about his build, something that made my stomach twist with recognition I couldn't quite place. I started documenting everything, keeping a journal of when the appearances happened, which mirror he used, what I was photographing at the time. The pattern that emerged was both simple and terrifying. He appeared every time I was about to take a photo. Not when I was cleaning my equipment, not when I was reviewing shots on my camera's LCD screen. Only in that precise moment when my finger hovered over the shutter button. The most logical explanation was that I was having some kind of breakdown. The isolation, the financial pressure, the constant rejection from galleries and magazines. It was enough to crack anyone. I'd read about photographers who'd lost themselves in their work, who'd started seeing things that weren't there, convinced that their cameras revealed hidden truths about reality. But then it started happening without mirrors. I was in Central Park, trying to capture the way autumn light filtered through the dying leaves, when I felt it. That familiar sensation of being watched, the prickle of awareness that someone was standing behind me. I spun around, camera clutched against my chest. but found only empty space where he should have been. Yet when I raised the camera again, I could sense him there, invisible but present, matching my movements, preparing to click his own shutter at the exact moment I clicked mine. The feeling was so strong, so undeniably real, that I could almost hear the whisper of his breathing, the soft scrape of his shoes against the gravel path. I began to avoid photography altogether. For 3 days, I left my camera in its bag, zipped up, and shoved under the Murphy bed like something shameful. I told myself I was taking a break, giving my mind time to reset, but the truth was simpler. I was terrified. Terrified of seeing him again, terrified of not seeing him, terrified of what it meant either way. But avoidance only made things worse. Without the distraction of work, the studio felt even smaller, more oppressive. The mirrors seemed to multiply in the corner of my vision, creating a maze of reflections that made it impossible to tell where the real walls ended and the illusions began. I found myself checking over my shoulder constantly, convinced that someone was standing behind me even when logic dictated it was impossible. Sleep became elusive. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt his presence in the darkness, sensed him moving through the space I couldn't see. Sometimes I thought I heard the soft click of a camera shutter, though I always convinced myself it was just the building settling or Mrs. Chen's television through the thin walls. On the 4th day, desperation drove me back to my camera. I had bills to pay, clients to satisfy, a life to maintain despite whatever was happening to my mind. I pulled the camera from its hiding place with shaking hands, powered it on, and raised it to my eye. The viewfinder showed the familiar chaos of my tiny studio, clothes draped over the single chair, dishes stacked in the microscopic sink, light streaming through the dirty window. And there he was, not in a mirror this time, but in the viewfinder itself. Standing behind me, camera raised, finger poised over the shutter. For the first time, I could see his face clearly, and the recognition hit me like ice water in my veins. It was me. Not exactly me. This version was somehow more focused, more confident, with eyes that held secrets mine didn't. But the basic features were unmistakable. The same nose, the same jawline, the same nervous habit of biting my lower lip when concentrating. It was as if I was looking at myself from another life, another possibility, another choice I might have made. I lowered the camera with numb fingers, turned to look behind me. Nothing there but the wall with its peeling paint and water stains. When I raised the camera again, he was gone from the viewfinder too, but I could still feel him there. Over the following days, my phantom double became more persistent. He appeared not just when I was taking photos, but when I was simply holding the camera, when I was cleaning it, even when I was just thinking about photography. Always behind me, always just out of direct sight, always perfectly synchronized with my movements. I began to understand that he wasn't random or chaotic. He was purposeful, methodical, as if he was documenting something specific. But what could he be photographing that I couldn't see? What was in his viewfinder that mine couldn't capture? The answer came to me gradually, like a photograph developing in chemicals. He wasn't photographing the same things I was. He was photographing me. Every time I raised my camera to capture the world, he raised his to capture me in the act of capturing. Every click of my shutter was met by the echo of his, creating a strange feedback loop of observation and documentation. I was both photographer and subject, observer and observed, real and reflection. The realization should have been liberating. Understanding the pattern, recognizing the purpose, it should have given me control. Instead, it filled me with a creeping dread that settled into my bones like winter fog. If he was photographing me, what was he doing with those images? Where were they going? Who was meant to see them? I started leaving the studio more often, telling myself it was to escape the oppressive mirrors and the constant sense of being watched. But even on the street, in the anonymity of the city, I felt his presence. In storefront windows, in the chrome surfaces of cars, in the black screens of phones, everywhere there was a reflection. There was the possibility of seeing him. The worst part was the growing suspicion that I was losing time. I would leave for what felt like a few hours and return to find the sun setting when it had been morning when I left. My camera's memory card would be full of photos I didn't remember taking, images of the studio from angles I'd never used, shots of the street from perspectives I'd never explored. The photos were good, better than my usual work, composed with an eye for detail and timing that exceeded my normal abilities. But they weren't mine. At least I didn't think they were mine. The line between what I had done and what he had done was becoming increasingly blurred, like looking through a camera lens smeared with fingerprints. I would find myself in positions I didn't remember assuming, holding my camera in ways that felt foreign but somehow natural, as if muscle memory was being written by someone else's mind. The breaking point came 3 weeks after that first clear sighting. I was photographing the sunrise through my tiny window, a ritual I'd developed to combat the insomnia that had taken permanent residence in my bones, when I noticed something wrong with the shadows. They were moving independently of their sources, shifting and dancing in ways that defied the steady morning light. As I watched through my viewfinder, the shadows began to coalesce into a familiar shape. Him. But this time, he wasn't behind me. He was beside me, occupying the same space, our bodies overlapping like double-exposed film. I could see through him to the wall beyond, but I could also see his camera, his hands, his face turned toward mine with an expression of infinite sadness. He was trying to tell me something. His mouth moved, forming words I couldn't hear, his free hand gesturing toward the window, toward the light, toward something beyond my understanding. But the meaning was lost in the static between realities, the interference between what was and what might be. I lowered my camera and turned to face him directly, but of course he wasn't there. The studio was empty except for me and my mounting panic, the morning light casting ordinary shadows that behaved exactly as shadows should. But when I looked down at my camera's LCD screen to review the shot I'd just taken, I saw both of us in the frame, standing side by side, cameras raised, capturing the same moment from slightly different angles. Two photographers, two perspectives, two versions of the same desperate attempt to freeze time and meaning into something comprehensible. I am writing this now because I don't know what else to do. The photos continue to appear on my memory card. Images I have no memory of taking, but which bear the unmistakable marks of my style, my vision, my need to document the world around me. Sometimes I find myself in positions I don't remember choosing, finger poised over a shutter I don't remember raising. The mirrors in this studio reflect truths I'm not sure I want to see, but I can't bring myself to cover them, can't bring myself to leave, because somewhere in the space between what I see and what sees me, between the click of my shutter and the echo of his, there might be an answer to the question that haunts every photographer. What is the difference between capturing reality and being captured by it? He's still here, behind me, beside me, inside the space where intention meets action. I can feel him preparing for the next shot, waiting for me to raise my camera so he can raise his. And I wonder, have I been documenting his world, or has he been documenting mine? The distinction, I'm beginning to understand, may be less important than I thought. I am going to take one more photograph now. Of this page, these words, this moment of uncertainty balanced on the edge of revelation. Maybe the image will show only me, alone in my tiny studio, typing the last lines of a story that explains everything or nothing at all. Or maybe it will show both of us, finally, together in the same frame, two aspects of the same desperate need to make sense of what we see and what sees us in return. I'm raising my camera now. He's raising his. Story 2. Fluorescent lights above my workstation flickered once, twice, then died with a hollow buzz that seemed to echo through the empty corridors of the computer science building. I'd been expecting this. The weather report had warned of severe thunderstorms, and the university's aging electrical grid was about as reliable as a fortune cookie prediction. What I hadn't expected was the metallic click of the security doors engaging their automatic locks, sealing me inside Lab 204 like some digital age pharaoh. My name is Marcus Chen, and I've been pulling these graveyard shifts for 3 years now, ever since I started my graduate program. The pay isn't much, but monitoring the university's server farm during the dead hours keeps me afloat financially and gives me plenty of time to work on my thesis. Usually the worst thing I deal with is a crashed backup system, or maybe a drunk undergrad trying to break into the building. Usually, the emergency lighting kicked in, casting everything in a sickly amber glow that made the familiar lab feel alien. Banks of servers hummed in their racks like mechanical insects, their status LEDs blinking red and green in chaotic patterns. The power outage had triggered every system to enter emergency mode, and now they were all desperately trying to maintain critical operations on backup power. I pulled out my phone to call campus security, but the screen showed no signal. The building's walls were thick concrete, and without the cell boosters powered up, I might as well have been shouting into a void. The landline on my desk was equally dead, just a flat dial tone that seemed to stretch into infinity. The logical part of my mind, the part that had spent years debugging code and troubleshooting network issues, told me this was all perfectly normal. Power outages caused security lockdowns. Backup systems took time to stabilize. The building's communication systems would be among the last to come back online, prioritized below critical research equipment and safety systems. But logic is a fragile thing at 3 a.m. when you're alone in a building that suddenly feels more like a tomb than a workplace. I started my rounds, checking each server rack methodically. The backup generators would keep the most critical systems running for maybe 4 hours, but I needed to manually restart the non-essential equipment once main power returned. It was routine work. Muscle memory developed over countless similar nights, but something felt different this time. The air conditioning should have shut down completely when the power died. It was one of the first systems to go offline during an emergency. Yet as I moved between the server racks, I felt a steady stream of cold air flowing from the ceiling vents. Not just residual coolness from before the outage, but active, frigid air that raised goosebumps along my arms and made my breath visible in small puffs. I stopped in front of Rack 7, where the main database servers lived, and held my hand up toward the nearest vent. The air was definitely flowing, definitely cold, but there was something else. A barely perceptible sound mixed with the airflow. Not the usual whistle of air through metal ducts, but something that almost resembled whispering. My rational mind offered up explanations. The backup generators powering essential cooling systems, acoustic tricks caused by pressure differentials, the building settling in the storm. But as I stood there in the amber half-light, listening to that not-quite whisper, I felt the first cold fingers of genuine fear crawling up my spine. The whispering resolved into something clearer, though I wished it hadn't. It was definitely a voice, low, barely audible, but unmistakably human. And it was repeating a name over and over. David, David, David. My hands were shaking as I checked the HVAC control panel mounted on the far wall. Every single indicator showed red, all systems offline just as they should be. The display confirmed what I already knew. There was no power going to the air conditioning units. Whatever was blowing that frigid air through the vents, it wasn't coming from any machine I understood. I tried to focus on my work, telling myself that stress and isolation were playing tricks on my perception. The servers needed attention, and dwelling on phantom voices would only make the situation worse. But as I moved through the lab, the whispering followed me, always just loud enough to be noticeable, always just clear enough to make out that name. David. The thing is, I knew who David was. David Park had been another graduate student, a quiet guy who'd worked these same night shifts about 2 years ago. We'd never been close, but I remembered him, always arriving early, staying late, totally devoted to his research on distributed computing systems. He'd left the program suddenly one semester, just stopped showing up to classes and meetings. The department had been vague about the details, mentioning only that he'd decided to pursue other opportunities. As I worked, fragments of half-remembered conversations began surfacing in my mind. Other students had whispered about David becoming increasingly paranoid during his final weeks, claiming that someone was watching him, that he could hear voices in the lab's ventilation system. The faculty had quietly suggested he might benefit from counseling services. Then he was simply gone, leaving behind only a partially completed thesis and a lingering sense of unease among those who'd known him. The cold air continued flowing from vents that should have been silent and dead. The whispered name grew clearer, more insistent, as if whatever was speaking was moving closer to the surface of audibility. I found myself checking over my shoulder constantly, scanning the shadows between server racks for movement that never quite materialized. By 4 a.m, the main power still hadn't returned, and the backup systems were beginning to show strain. Several non-critical servers had automatically shut down to conserve energy, their status lights going dark one by one like dying stars. The lab was growing warmer everywhere except near the vents, where that impossible Arctic breeze continued to flow. I was running diagnostics on the primary research server when I heard my own name mixed with David's in the whispered litany flowing from the ceiling. Marcus. David. Marcus. David. The two names intertwined like a chant, like a roll call for the damned. My thesis research suddenly felt very far away. The career prospects that had motivated me to take these late-night shifts seemed insignificant compared to the growing certainty that something was fundamentally wrong with this place. I began to understand why David might have left so abruptly, why he might have started hearing voices that others dismissed as stress-induced hallucinations. The emergency lighting flickered, and for a moment the lab plunged into complete darkness, except for the scattered LED indicators on the remaining active equipment. In that darkness, the whispering stopped entirely, leaving only a silence so complete it felt like physical pressure against my eardrums. When the light stabilized, I was no longer alone. A figure stood at the far end of the lab, barely visible in the amber gloom, perfectly still between two server racks. My heart hammered against my ribs as I tried to focus on the shape, to determine if it was really there, or just a trick of shadows and stressed perception. The figure appeared to be wearing the same blue university maintenance uniform that all the IT staff used, but something about its proportions seemed wrong. Too tall, too thin, like a person stretched beyond normal human dimensions. I called out, my voice cracking slightly. "Hello? Who's there? Are you from security?" The figure didn't respond, didn't move, didn't acknowledge my presence in any way. It simply stood there like a mannequin, while the whispering resumed from the vents overhead, now adding a third name to its rotation. Marcus. David. Sarah. Sarah Rodriguez. Another former graduate student, another name from the department's collective memory of people who'd simply vanished from the program. I'd never connected her departure to David's, had never thought to look for patterns in the steady turnover of night shift workers. But now the connection seemed obvious and terrifying. I backed toward the lab's main door, keeping my eyes fixed on the motionless figure while my hands fumbled for the emergency manual release. The mechanism was stiff, but it finally gave way with a loud clang that echoed through the building. The door swung open, revealing the darkened hallway beyond. I ran. The corridor stretched endlessly in both directions, lit only by the same emergency lighting that had transformed the lab into a purgatory of amber shadows. My footsteps echoed strangely, as if the building's acoustics had fundamentally changed during the power outage. Behind me, I could still hear the whispering, though whether it was coming from the lab's vents or following me through the halls, I couldn't tell. The main stairwell was at the building's center, but as I ran toward it, the hallways seemed to extend and multiply, creating passages I didn't remember from my 3 years of working in this building. Doors that should have led to faculty offices opened onto storage closets. Familiar landmarks, bulletin boards, water fountains, fire extinguisher cabinets, appeared in wrong locations or not at all. I found myself standing in front of a door marked Lab 204, the same lab I'd just fled from, though I was certain I'd been running in the opposite direction. The nameplate beside the door listed 3 graduate assistants authorized for after-hours access: David Park, Sarah Rodriguez, and Marcus Chen. The door was slightly ajar, and through the gap, I could see the familiar amber glow of emergency lighting and hear the steady whisper of impossible air conditioning. The voice from the vents was clearer now, more insistent, and it was calling my name with increasing urgency. I stepped inside. The lab looked exactly as I'd left it, except that the motionless figure was gone. Every server was running normally, their status lights blinking in healthy green patterns. The HVAC control panel showed all systems online and operational, despite the continued power outage indicated by the emergency lighting. On my workstation, the computer monitor displayed a document I didn't remember opening, a thesis defense schedule from 2 years ago. David Park's name was at the top, with a defense date that had never occurred. Below his entry, in smaller text, was a note from the department administrator. Student withdrawn from program due to health concerns. Recommend psychological evaluation before readmission consideration. I scrolled down and found Sarah Rodriguez's entry, marked with similar annotations. Then, at the bottom of the document, I saw my own name with today's date and a note I definitely hadn't written. Experiencing audio hallucinations and paranoid delusions. Recommend immediate intervention. The whispering from the vents had stopped, but I could feel eyes watching me from every shadow, from every dark corner between the server racks. The lab's familiar equipment suddenly seemed alien and threatening, like props in a play where I'd forgotten my lines. My phone buzzed. Impossible, since there'd been no signal all night. The message was from an unknown number. The building doesn't want you to leave, Marcus, but you don't have to stay forever. David and Sarah found another way. I looked around the lab one final time, noting details I'd somehow missed during my years of working here. Scratch marks on the walls near the vents, as if someone had tried to claw their way into the ductwork. A faint outline on the floor in the shape of a human body. A small pile of personal belongings in the corner that included ID badges I recognized. The emergency lighting flickered again, and in that moment of darkness, I heard something that made my blood freeze. The sound of multiple voices whispering my name in perfect unison. Not from the vents this time, but from all around me, as if the walls themselves had learned to speak. When the lights came back, I was standing in front of the open door leading to the hallway. Behind me, the lab hummed with normal activity, servers processing data, cooling systems maintaining optimal temperatures, everything functioning exactly as it should. Ahead of me stretched the familiar corridor, properly lit now by the building's normal fluorescent fixtures, with exit signs glowing their reassuring red. The power had returned. The emergency was over. I was free to leave, but as I stood in that doorway, suspended between the lab and the hallway, between captivity and freedom, I couldn't shake the feeling that the choice wasn't really mine to make. The building had shown me something during those dark hours, revealed a truth about the pattern of disappearances, about the real nature of the night shift in Lab 204. I could leave now, walk away, report the incident as a stress-induced breakdown. I could transfer to day shifts, finish my degree, and pretend that nothing had happened. But I knew, with absolute certainty, that I would be back, tomorrow night, or the next week, or eventually. The lab would call to me the same way it had called to David and Sarah, the same way it whispered names through vents that shouldn't have power. Some patterns, once you see them, become impossible to break. I stepped into the hallway, but I didn't head for the exit. Instead, I turned back toward Lab 204, where my workstation waited patiently for my return, where the servers hummed their electronic lullabies, where the air conditioning whispered names of those who'd tried to leave, but somehow never quite managed to make it all the way out. The building was patient. It could wait for me to understand, to accept what I'd already known deep down, that some jobs are more than employment, some shifts never really end. As I settled back into my chair and watched the monitors flicker to life, I heard a new voice join the whispered chorus in the vents. My own voice, calling softly to whoever would take the next shift, whoever would inherit this amber-lit purgatory of humming machines and impossible choices. The pattern was complete. The night shift continued, and somewhere in the building's electrical system, in the spaces between the walls where cold air flows and voices gather, David and Sarah and I waited patiently for the next name to add to our eternal roster. Story 3. The divorce papers still carried the scent of Margaret's perfume when I signed them 3 weeks ago. Now, Standing in my new studio apartment at 2:17 a.m., I wondered if the lingering fragrance was real or just another phantom haunting the corners of my fractured mind. The climate-controlled wine cellar hummed quietly in the corner, a temperature-regulated sanctuary that had cost more than most people's cars. It was the only thing I'd fought for in the settlement, the only piece of our shared life I couldn't bear to lose. I'd been a sommelier for 15 years, my palate trained to detect the subtlest notes in a vintage, my memory cataloged with thousands of bottles and their stories. Wine was mathematics and poetry combined, precision and passion dancing on the tongue. It was the one constant in a world that had recently crumbled around me. The apartment was sterile, modern, with floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out onto the city's restless lights. I'd chosen it for its location, close to the restaurant where I worked, and for the space it provided for my collection. The climate cellar fit perfectly against the far wall, its glass door revealing neat rows of bottles lying in darkness, each label carefully positioned, each vintage precisely cataloged. That first night, I'd arranged them methodically, the Burgundies on the top shelf, Bordeaux in the middle, with my prized Italian selections below, 47 bottles in total, what remained after Margaret claimed half of everything we'd built together. Each bottle held a memory, a moment frozen in fermented time. Sleep came fitfully those first few nights. The unfamiliar sounds of the building, the way shadows fell differently through the windows, the absence of Margaret's breathing beside me. Everything felt wrong, displaced. But by the fourth morning, I'd established a routine. Coffee first, then a careful inspection of my collection before heading to work. It was during one of these morning rituals that I first noticed the irregularity. A bottle of 1998 Barolo sat on the kitchen counter. I stood there, coffee mug suspended halfway to my lips, staring at the familiar label. Giacomo Conterno, a bottle I remembered drinking with vivid clarity. It had been Margaret's birthday, 5 years ago. We'd opened it with L'Amo Bucco, and I could still taste the wine's complex tannins, the way it had paired perfectly with the rich marrow. The bottle had been empty when we'd finished, I was certain. I remembered washing the bottle myself, feeling the weight of its absence as I'd placed it in the recycling bin. Yet here it was, cork intact, foil seal unbroken. The bottle vibrated slightly, so subtly I convinced myself it was the building's HVAC system causing the tremor. I returned it to the cellar, chalking the incident up to stress-induced confusion. Divorce did strange things to the mind, I reasoned. Memory played tricks when the heart was broken. But the next morning, another bottle appeared. This time, a 2001 Chateauneuf du Pape that I distinctly remembered finishing during my bachelor party 8 years ago. My best man had brought it as a joke. "One last taste of the good life before marriage ruins your palate," he'd laughed. We'd drunk it straight from the bottle on the hotel balcony, watching the sunrise paint the city gold. The bottle sat on my dining table, perfectly centered, as if placed there with ceremonial precision. Like the Barolo, it trembled with an almost imperceptible motion, as though something alive stirred within the glass. I began keeping a journal, documenting each occurrence. The pattern was always the same. I'd retire to bed with my collection intact, wake to find a bottle displaced from its proper position, always one I remembered consuming completely. The bottles never appeared broken or tampered with. They looked exactly as they had when I'd first acquired them, down to the dust patterns on their labels. By the second week, the appearances had become nightly. A 1996 Chianti Classico that I'd shared with my father before his surgery. A 2003 Sancerre that Margaret and I had opened on our first anniversary. A 2000 champagne from our wedding reception. Each bottle carried the weight of memory, each one vibrating with that strange, subtle energy that made my skin crawl. I started leaving notes for myself, detailed descriptions of my collection's exact arrangement before bed. Each morning, I'd find the notes exactly where I'd left them, my handwriting unchanged, but the bottles would be displaced nonetheless. The cellar's temperature remained constant at 55 degrees, the humidity at 70%. The lock showed no signs of tampering, the glass door remained pristine. The restaurant began to suffer. My colleagues noticed my distraction. The way I'd lose track of conversations mid-sentence. How my hands trembled when handling bottles during service. I'd catch myself staring at wine lists, searching for bottles that matched those appearing in my apartment, convinced I'd see them listed somewhere. Proof that I wasn't losing my mind. "You look terrible," Marcus, the head chef, mentioned during our third week of service. "When's the last time you actually slept?" Sleep had become elusive. I'd lie in bed, hyper-aware of every sound from the kitchen, every creak of the building settling. The humming of the climate cellars seemed louder in the darkness, more insistent. Sometimes I'd hear what sounded like glass touching glass, the gentle clink of bottles being moved. But whenever I'd investigate, everything appeared normal. Except for the displaced bottle, always sitting somewhere new, always vibrating with that barely perceptible tremor. I tried sleeping elsewhere, the couch, a hotel room, even my office at the restaurant. But the next morning, I'd always return to find another bottle waiting. It was as if whatever force controlled this phenomenon knew exactly where I was, what I was doing, mocking my attempts to escape. The bottles began appearing closer to where I slept. First on the coffee table near the couch, then on the nightstand when I returned to the bedroom, finally on the pillow beside me. I'd wake with the cold glass pressed against my cheek, the bottle's vibration transferring through my skin like a message I couldn't decode. I researched everything I could find about unexplained phenomena, poring over articles about poltergeists, electromagnetic fields, psychological manifestations of guilt and grief. The rational part of my mind insisted there had to be an explanation. Perhaps I was sleepwalking, rearranging my own collection in some unconscious state. But security cameras I'd installed showed nothing unusual, just hours of static footage of my sleeping form while bottles somehow materialized beyond the camera's range. The memories associated with each displaced bottle grew more vivid, more painful. I could taste the wines with perfect clarity, remember every conversation they'd accompanied, every emotion they'd helped process. It was as if the bottles were demanding acknowledgement, forcing me to relive moments I'd tried to bury beneath the routine of rebuilding my life. A therapist might have called it manifestation of guilt, projections of a mind struggling to process loss. But the weight of the bottles in my hands felt undeniably real, their vibrations distinct and purposeful. Sometimes I'd catch myself listening to them, pressing my ear against the glass as if they contained messages waiting to be decoded. The breakthrough came on a Thursday night during the third week. I'd been lying awake, watching the red digits of my alarm clock mark the passage of time, when I heard it clearly, the sound of liquid moving within glass. Not the gentle slosh of wine settling, but something more deliberate, rhythmic, like breathing. I approached the cellar slowly, my bare feet silent on the cold floor. Inside, every bottle remained in its designated position, but one, a 2005 Burgundy I'd shared with Margaret on the night we'd decided to start trying for children, glowed faintly from within. The wine inside moved with its own current, swirling patterns of light and shadow that defied physics. As I watched, transfixed, the bottle began to vibrate more intensely. The movement spread to its neighbors, then throughout the entire collection, until every bottle hummed with synchronized energy. The sound filled the apartment, not loud but pervasive, resonating in my bones. I reached for the door handle, but stopped when I realized the truth that had been building in my subconscious for weeks. These weren't just bottles I'd drunk. They were bottles I'd shared, moments of connection that had been severed when my marriage ended. Each wine represented a bridge between past and present, memory and reality, and something was trying to rebuild those connections. The question wasn't whether the phenomenon was real or imagined. The question was whether I was ready to accept what it meant. Standing there in my sterile apartment, surrounded by the gentle humming of impossible bottles, I understood that some endings don't conclude cleanly. Some memories refuse to be archived, categorized, and forgotten. They vibrate with their own energy, demanding attention, refusing to let us move forward until we acknowledge what we've lost. The bottles continued their gentle trembling as dawn approached, and I realized I might never know whether they were real or products of my fractured psyche. Perhaps that distinction didn't matter anymore. Perhaps the important thing was learning to live with the uncertainty, to accept that some experiences transcend explanation. I poured myself a glass of water and sat down to watch my collection hum with impossible life, waiting to see which memory would demand acknowledgement next. Story 4. The cassette recorder hadn't been plugged in for 3 months. I knew this with the same certainty that I knew my own name, because I'd moved into this cramped studio apartment in March, and the old Panasonic had been sitting on my desk like a forgotten relic ever since. Its cord dangled uselessly behind the particle board surface, the plug gathering dust beside a tangle of charging cables I never bothered to organize. Yet here it was, at 3:17 a.m., its red recording light pulsing in the darkness like a mechanical heartbeat. The tape had been rewound to the beginning. I sat up in bed, my journalist's instincts warring with something deeper, a primal unease that made my skin crawl. The dream still echoed in my skull, that haunting melody without words, a sequence of notes that seemed to burrow into my auditory cortex and set up residence there. It wasn't music in any conventional sense. It was something else entirely, a frequency that felt wrong, like nails on the chalkboard of reality itself. The recorder's display glowed green in the pre-dawn gloom. Ready to record? I'd been a music journalist for 12 years, had interviewed everyone from garage band nobodies to Grammy winners, and I'd never experienced anything like that dream. The melody, if I could even call it that, had been both beautiful and excruciating, like hearing color or tasting sound. My ears still rang with phantom echoes of those impossible notes. Rising from the futon that served as my bed, I padded across the hardwood floor toward my desk. The apartment was a shoebox, barely 400 square feet of gentrified misery in what used to be Detroit's warehouse district. Through the single window, sodium streetlights painted everything in sickly amber, casting long shadows that seemed to writhe when I wasn't looking directly at them. The recorder sat exactly where I'd left it, beneath a stack of press releases and next to my laptop. But something was different. The tape inside wasn't one of mine. I recognized the collection of Maxell and TDK cassettes scattered around my workspace, labeled with band names and interview dates in my own cramped handwriting. This tape was unmarked, its case a faded black that looked older than everything else in the room. I reached for the power button, then hesitated. The red light continued its rhythmic pulse, hypnotic and somehow urgent. My finger hovered over the switch, trembling slightly. What if turning it off erased whatever was on the tape? What if there was nothing on the tape? What if there was something I wasn't ready to hear? The questions multiplied in my mind like bacteria, each one spawning doubts about my own perceptions. I'd been under stress lately. My editor at Frequency magazine had been pushing for the expose on underground music venues, and I'd been burning through savings faster than I could replenish them. Sleep deprivation could cause hallucinations. Maybe I'd sleepwalked. Maybe I'd set up the recorder myself and forgotten. But I knew I hadn't. The certainty sat in my stomach like a stone. I pressed the rewind button, listening to the mechanical whir as the tape spools reversed. The sound seemed unnaturally loud in the apartment's suffocating silence, and I found myself glancing toward the window, half expecting to see a face pressed against the glass. Nothing there, just the empty street and the distant glow of the 24-hour diner where I sometimes wrote when the walls closed in too tight. When the rewind stopped, I hit play. Static filled the room, the familiar white noise of an empty tape. I leaned closer, adjusting the volume. Still nothing. Disappointment mingled with relief as I reached for the stop button. But then I heard it. A faint humming beneath the static, so low it was almost subsonic. The hair on my arms stood up, and that dream melody began to resurface in my consciousness, not as memory, but as if it were being played again, right here, right now. The humming grew stronger, resolving into something that might have been a voice if voices could exist without vocal cords, without breath, without any biological origin at all. It rose and fell in patterns that my brain struggled to process, frequencies that seemed to exist in the spaces between notes rather than as notes themselves. I yanked my hand back from the recorder as if it had burned me. The sound continued, even though I hadn't touched anything. The volume was increasing on its own, the impossible voice growing clearer and more defined. It wasn't speaking words, at least not in any language I recognized, but somehow I understood it was trying to communicate. The meaning bypassed my ears entirely, flooding directly into my consciousness like water through a broken dam. "Come closer." I stumbled backward, knocking over my desk chair. The voice wasn't coming from the recorder anymore. It was inside my head, wrapped around my thoughts like invasive vines. My vision blurred, and for a moment the apartment seemed to stretch and warp, the walls breathing like the interior of some vast organism. "Come closer." The words weren't words at all, but I felt their meaning in my bones. The melody from my dream was building now, each note a spike driven into my temporal lobe. I pressed my palms against my ears, but the sound wasn't external anymore. It was part of me, woven into my neural pathways like a parasitic symphony. Through my fingers, I could see the recorder's display. The tape counter was moving forward, but impossibly fast, the numbers blurring past in a digital stream. 05, 23, 12:44, 28, 16. The tape should have been only 90 minutes long, but the counter kept climbing. The streetlight outside began to flicker, casting strobing shadows across the walls. Or maybe it was my vision that was flickering. I couldn't tell anymore. The boundary between perception and reality had become as fluid as the melody that threaded through my consciousness, transforming everything it touched. I forced myself to focus on concrete details: the scratched surface of my desk, the smell of old coffee and takeout containers, the feeling of cold hardwood beneath my bare feet. These sensations anchored me, kept me from drifting too far into whatever space the voice was trying to pull me toward. But the anchors were loosening. The apartment had changed while I wasn't paying attention. The walls were farther away now, or maybe I was smaller. The ceiling stretched impossibly high, disappearing into darkness that hadn't been there before. My futon sat like an island in an ocean of shadow, and the desk with its pulsing recorder had become a distant shore. "You've been listening for so long." This time the voice was clearer, almost conversational. I turned toward the sound and saw myself sitting at the desk, headphones on, frantically taking notes as the recorder played. But that couldn't be right. I was standing across the room, wasn't I? I looked down at my hands and saw notebook pages covered in symbols that hurt to look at directly, each mark seeming to writhe and shift when I tried to focus on it. The other me, the one at the desk, looked up and smiled. His eyes were black holes in a face that was mine but wrong, features slightly off like a photograph that had been left in the sun too long. "Finally ready to hear the whole song?" he asked, and his voice was the same impossible frequency that had been drilling into my skull. I tried to speak, to deny whatever was happening, but my throat felt lined with cotton. The melody was everywhere now, not just in my ears, but in my bloodstream, pumping through my heart and spreading to every cell in my body. I was becoming the song, or it was becoming me. The distinction seemed less important with each passing moment. The tape counter had stopped at 99.99, an impossible number that my rational mind rejected even as I watched the digits pulse in perfect rhythm with the red recording light. How long had I been standing here? Minutes? Hours? The concept of time felt as fluid as everything else in this space that used to be my apartment. Movement in my peripheral vision drew my attention to the window. The empty street was no longer empty. Figures stood beneath the streetlights, perfectly still, all facing my building. They were too far away to make out clearly, but something about their posture suggested they were listening, heads tilted at the same angle, as if they were all hearing the same frequency that was rewiring my brain. "They've been waiting," the other me said, and I realized I hadn't been looking at him when he spoke. He was still at the desk, still writing in that impossible notebook, but his words came from everywhere and nowhere. Some of them have been standing there for years, just listening, waiting for someone to complete the recording. The figures began to move, a slow procession toward my building. Their movement was synchronized, like dancers following choreography only they could hear. As they drew closer, I could see that they weren't quite right. Their proportions were slightly off, their gaits just unnatural enough to trigger every evolutionary alarm bell in my nervous system. "What do they want?" I managed to whisper. "To hear the end," he replied without looking up from his writing. "The song has been playing for decades, passed from one listener to the next, but no one has ever let it finish. They always turn it off, or destroy the tape, or run away. You're the first one who's strong enough to hear it all the way through." The procession was at my building now. I couldn't see them from this angle, but I could feel their presence like pressure in my ears. The melody was reaching some kind of crescendo, building toward a resolution that felt both inevitable and terrifying. Each note was a step closer to something I couldn't name but instinctively feared. "What happens when it ends?" I asked. The other me finally looked up, and his smile widened impossibly, stretching beyond the boundaries of human anatomy. "It doesn't end," he said. "It begins." The recorder's red light pulsed faster now, matching the accelerated rhythm of my heart. The tape counter had become a blur of changing numbers, cycling through impossible combinations. The melody was no longer just sound. It was color, texture, meaning, existence itself. I was dissolving into it, losing the boundaries that separated self from song. But some part of me, some stubborn core of journalistic skepticism, still fought against the dissolution. I focused on that part, fed it with questions and doubts. What if this was all psychological? What if the stress of my failing career had finally snapped something essential in my mind? What if there was no tape, no impossible melody, no procession of listeners in the street below? The questions created tiny fissures in the reality surrounding me. Through them, I caught glimpses of something else. My apartment, small and cramped and normal, with me sitting at my desk in boxers and a torn t-shirt, staring at a silent cassette recorder. No music, no other me, no cosmic horror masquerading as melody. But then the fissures sealed themselves, and I was back in the expanding space that used to be my home, listening to the song that was rebuilding me from the inside out. "Doubt is just another frequency," the other me said gently. "It harmonizes beautifully with revelation." The truth hit me like a physical blow. It didn't matter whether this was real or delusion, whether the melody existed outside my head or was purely psychological. The experience itself had become my reality. I was changing, had been changing since the moment I first heard those impossible notes in my dream. Whether the transformation was supernatural or psychological was irrelevant. The result would be the same. I would become a listener, another figure standing beneath streetlights, head tilted at the perfect angle to catch the frequency that rewrote human consciousness. I would wait for the next person to find the recorder, to hear the song, to either succumb or pass it on. The chain would continue, each listener adding their own harmonies to the endless composition. The melody reached its crescendo, and I felt myself scatter into component frequencies, each part of my consciousness becoming a note in the greater symphony. But even as I dissolved, I retained just enough awareness to understand the terrible beauty of what was happening. The song wasn't destroying me. It was showing me what I really was beneath the illusion of individual existence. We were all notes in the same endless composition, separated only by the finite range of human hearing. The recorder was just an amplifier, a way to experience the music that was always playing, had always been playing, would always be playing. The red recording light pulsed one final time, and everything went silent. I opened my eyes. I was sitting at my desk, the recorder in front of me. The display showed 0.00. The tape was rewound to the beginning, ready to record. Daylight streamed through the window, and the street outside was empty except for a few early commuters heading to work. Had I dreamed it all? The memory of the night's events felt both crystal clear and utterly impossible. I reached for the recorder, then hesitated. My notebook lay open beside it, filled with my own handwriting. But the words made no sense. Fragments about frequencies and impossible melodies, observations about the nature of consciousness and reality that read like the ravings of someone who'd spent too many sleepless nights chasing deadlines. At the bottom of the page, in handwriting that was mine but somehow different. I'd written, "The song is incomplete, still recording. We'll wait for the next listener." I stared at those words for a long time, trying to remember writing them. The apartment felt too small, too quiet. Outside, I could hear the normal sounds of the city waking up, but underneath them, just at the edge of perception, was something else. A humming, faint but persistent, growing stronger. I looked at the recorder's red light. It wasn't pulsing anymore, but it was on, ready to record, ready to capture whatever frequency was building in the silence between seconds, in the spaces between thoughts. My finger hovered over the play button. After all, I was a journalist. And every journalist knows that some stories can only be told by becoming part of them. The light pulsed once, as if in agreement. I pressed play. Story 5. The trail markers had been lying to me for the past hour. I realized this as I stood before what should have been the Revolutionary War cemetery, according to my park map, but instead found myself staring at a moss-covered stone foundation that predated any conflict I'd studied. The rectangular outline suggested a church or meeting house, though no historical record I'd encountered mentioned such a structure in Whitmore Historic Park. As a professor of colonial American history, I'd researched this area extensively for my upcoming lecture series. Yet this ruin felt like discovering a page torn from a book I thought I knew by heart. The October air carried that peculiar stillness that comes before dusk, when even the wind seems to hold its breath. I pulled out my phone to photograph the foundation, noting how the shadows fell in sharp angles across the weathered stones. The light had that golden quality that photographers prize, but something about it made my skin crawl. Perhaps it was how the shadows seemed deeper than they should be, or how the silence pressed against my eardrums like cotton wool. That's when I first heard it. The humming drifted through the trees behind me, so faint I initially mistook it for wind through the branches. But wind doesn't carry melody, and this was definitely a tune. Slow, mournful, with the characteristic cadence of a hymn. The notes rose and fell with the measured pace of a funeral dirge, though the melody was unfamiliar despite my extensive knowledge of colonial-era religious music. I turned slowly, smartphone already switching to voice recorder mode, but the humming stopped the moment I faced the sound's direction. The forest stretched before me in typical New England fashion, oak and maple trees standing like sentinels, their trunks disappearing into the gathering gloom between them. Nothing moved. Even the usual rustle of small animals had ceased, as if the entire woodland was holding its breath. After 30 seconds of silence, I turned back to the foundation and immediately heard the humming resume. This time I didn't turn around. Instead, I kept my eyes fixed on the ancient stones while my thumb found the record button. The melody was clearer now, definitely a hymn, but one I couldn't place despite my doctorate in colonial American religious practices. The tune had that haunting quality of music from the earliest settlements, when survival and spirituality intertwined in ways that later generations would find difficult to understand. The voice, for it was clearly a human voice now, not my imagination, carried no words, just that steady, melancholic humming that seemed to emanate from approximately 30 feet behind me. Male, I thought, though something about the tone made precise identification difficult. The pitch wavered occasionally, as if the singer were walking while humming, his attention partially focused elsewhere. I kept recording for 3 minutes before the humming faded into silence. When I played back the recording, my hands trembling slightly as I held the phone, I heard only the ambient sounds of the forest. Wind, distant traffic from the main road, the creak of branches, my own breathing. Nothing else. The rational part of my mind, the part trained in academic skepticism, immediately began constructing explanations. Audio equipment malfunction, a trick of acoustics in this particular terrain. The human brain's tendency to impose patterns on random sounds. I'd read papers on auditory pareidolia, the phenomenon that makes people hear voices in white noise or see faces in clouds. Surely this was a textbook case. But as I pocketed my phone and prepared to leave the foundation, the humming started again. This time I felt it as much as heard it, a vibration that seemed to resonate in my chest cavity. The melody was more complex now, with harmonies that suggested multiple voices, though the sound still came from that same spot behind me. I forced myself to remain facing forward, every instinct screaming at me to turn around, to confront whatever was creating these sounds. The academic in me began cataloging details. The harmony structure suggested a psalm setting common in the 1600s, possibly earlier. The modal quality reminded me of music from before the standardization of Western tonality, when churches experimented with scales that modern ears found unsettling. This particular arrangement had that quality, beautiful yet somehow wrong, like viewing a familiar landscape through a distorting lens. Sweat beaded on my forehead despite the cool air. The humming continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. When it finally stopped, the silence that followed was so absolute it made my ears ring. No birds, no insects, no distant traffic. Even the wind had died completely. I turned around. Nothing. Just empty forest. The trees standing in perfect stillness like a painting. But as soon as I completed my turn, the humming resumed from behind me again. This impossible game of auditory hide-and-seek sent ice down my spine. Whatever was making these sounds was either moving with supernatural speed, or the sounds themselves were somehow shifting around me. For the first time since arriving at the park, I considered leaving. My research could wait, but as I took a step toward the trail that had brought me here, I realized I couldn't remember which direction I'd come from. The paths all looked the same in the dying light, winding between trees that had grown identical in the growing darkness. I pulled out my phone again, this time for its GPS function, and discovered I had no signal. The screen showed those familiar words that had become the bane of the digital age. No service. But I'd had full bars when I'd first arrived. I'd even posted a photo of the park entrance to my social media account. The humming behind me grew louder, more insistent. The harmony had expanded into what sounded like a full choir now, dozens of voices weaving together in that haunting modal arrangement. Yet when I strained to listen carefully, I could still only identify a single voice, as if one singer was somehow producing all the harmonies simultaneously. My hands shook as I tried the GPS again. Still nothing. The battery indicator showed full charge, but the device seemed unable to locate any satellites. This shouldn't have been possible in an area so close to civilization, but the phone might as well have been a paperweight. Behind me, the choir, or singer, or whatever it was, began adding words to the melody. I couldn't make them out clearly, but they sounded like archaic English, the kind found in the earliest colonial documents. Something about providence and wilderness, salvation and soil. The words seemed to shift and blur, as if spoken through water or across a great distance. I forced myself to walk toward what I hoped was the direction of the main trail. The humming followed, always maintaining that 30-foot distance behind me. With each step I took, the sound moved correspondingly, as if tethered to my position by an invisible rope. The impossibility of this arrangement was becoming harder to rationalize away. The forest around me began to feel different. The trees seemed taller, older, their bark-bearing patterns I didn't remember from my hike in. The undergrowth grew thicker, tangling around my feet in ways that suggested this area hadn't seen human traffic in decades. Yet I'd been walking on clearly marked trails just hours earlier. As full darkness settled over the park, I began to notice other impossibilities. The temperature was dropping faster than it should, my breath beginning to form visible puffs in air that had been comfortably warm when I'd arrived. The darkness itself felt wrong, too complete, too absolute. Even on the cloudiest nights, some ambient light from nearby towns should have been visible through the trees. The humming had evolved into what could only be described as a funeral dirge now, the kind of music that accompanied burials in the earliest colonial settlements. The melody carried notes of desperation, of people clinging to faith in the face of incomprehensible wilderness. It was beautiful and terrifying in equal measure, the sort of music that belonged to a time when the line between civilization and chaos was measured in yards rather than miles. I tried calling out, asking if anyone was there, if someone needed help. My voice sounded thin and strange in the absolute stillness, as if the air itself was absorbing the sound before it could travel more than a few feet. The humming continued without pause, unaffected by my attempts at communication. Hours seemed to pass, though my watch had stopped working, its digital display frozen at 6:47. I walked in what I hoped were straight lines, but the humming remained constantly behind me, never growing closer or farther away. The forest path, if it could still be called a path, became increasingly difficult to navigate. Roots emerged from the ground at ankle height, rocks appeared where none had been moments before, and fallen branches blocked passages that had been clear when I'd approached them. The choir behind me began singing in earnest now, full voices raised in that haunting hymn. The words became clearer, though they spoke of concepts that made no logical sense. They sang of trees that grew downward into sky, of soil that thirsted for stars, of congregations that gathered in the spaces between heartbeats. The language was definitely archaic English, but arranged in ways that violated grammar and meaning. My rational mind kept insisting this was some form of psychotic break, that the stress of my upcoming tenure review had finally caused a complete mental collapse. Auditory hallucinations were common in certain forms of psychological distress. The GPS failure could be explained by equipment malfunction. The disorientation was simply panic affecting my navigation abilities, but the singing felt too real, too physically present. I could feel it in my bones, in the cavity of my chest, in the spaces between my ribs. When the harmonies swelled, my heart seemed to beat in rhythm with the music. When the voices dropped to whispers, my breathing slowed to match their cadence. I began to notice that my footsteps were making no sound. The ground beneath my feet yielded normally, leaves crunched and twigs snapped, but no sound accompanied these actions. Only the singing behind me produced any audible effect, as if the forest had become selectively mute to all sounds except that impossible choir. The realization that I might be lost permanently began to settle in my mind like sediment in still water. I had no functional GPS, no cell service, no landmarks I recognized. The darkness was so complete that I couldn't see more than a few feet in any direction, even with my phone's flashlight. The battery indicator had begun dropping precipitously, from full charge to less than 20%, in what felt like minutes. The singing grew more complex, layering harmonies upon harmonies until it sounded like hundreds of voices arranged in a cathedral of impossible acoustics. Yet it remained clearly the product of a single throat, somehow producing this orchestral complexity through means I couldn't comprehend. The melody had become hypnotic, drawing me deeper into its patterns until I realized I was unconsciously walking in rhythm with the music. When I forced myself to break that rhythm, to walk arrhythmically against the beat, the forest around me seemed to shift. Trees that had been on my left appeared on my right. Clearings I'd passed through moments before materialized ahead of me again. The path beneath my feet curved in directions that defied the topology I'd observed moments earlier. The impossibility of my situation was becoming undeniable, yet equally impossible to accept. Either I was experiencing a complete psychological breakdown of unprecedented severity, or the forest itself was operating according to rules that violated basic principles of physics and geography. Neither option offered comfort. As the night deepened, assuming it was still night, assuming time was still progressing linearly, the singing began to include my name. Not called out directly, but woven into the melody as if it had always been part of the hymn. The voices sang of Professor William Harrison's research, of his dedication to understanding colonial religious practices, of his presence in this sacred space between worlds. How they knew my name and profession should have been my primary concern. But by then, rational analysis had given way to a deeper, more primitive form of awareness. The part of my brain that had evolved to recognize predators was screaming warnings, but the predator in this case seemed to be reality itself, which had begun operating according to logic I couldn't comprehend. The ground beneath my feet started to feel different, softer, more yielding, as if I were walking on recently turned earth rather than packed forest soil. The air carried scents that belonged to underground spaces, loam, decay, the mineral smell of deep soil. Yet I was clearly still in a forest, surrounded by trees whose bark I could touch, whose branches I could see outlined against the star-free sky. My phone battery died completely, plunging me into absolute darkness. The singing continued, no longer simply behind me but surrounding me, coming from every direction simultaneously. The harmonies had become so complex that individual voices were impossible to distinguish, yet somehow I could still identify that single original hummer among the multitude. In the perfect darkness, other senses became heightened. I could feel the forest breathing around me, a slow, rhythmic expansion and contraction that matched the tempo of the hymn. The air moved in patterns that suggested vast spaces, as if I were standing in a cathedral rather than among trees. My footsteps began echoing, sharp sounds that returned from impossible distances. The singing reached a crescendo that made my teeth ache and my vision explode with patterns of light that shouldn't have been possible in such complete darkness. The harmonies expanded beyond human vocal range, incorporating sounds that belonged to instruments that didn't exist, to acoustics that defied architectural possibility. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. The silence was so absolute it felt like physical weight pressing against my eardrums. No wind, no distant traffic, no ambient sound of any kind. Even my own heartbeat seemed muffled, as if my body were wrapped in layers of invisible insulation. Light began to return gradually, though its source was unclear. Not dawn, the quality was wrong for sunrise. Too silver, too cold. But slowly, shapes began to resolve around me. I was standing in a circular clearing I didn't remember entering, surrounded by trees that stood in perfect symmetry like pillars in a temple. At the center of the clearing stood a simple wooden cross, weathered gray with age. At its base, barely visible in the strange light, was a small brass plaque bearing an inscription in script, so archaic I had to crouch to decipher it. Here lies the voice of the faithful, who sing eternal in the spaces between silence. Below that, in slightly more modern lettering, erected by the Whitmore Historical Society, 1847. I photographed the plaque with my mysteriously functional phone, though the timestamp showed an impossible date 3 months in the future. When I checked my voice recordings from earlier, they were all there. Hours of hymnal singing in perfect clarity, harmonies that filled my phone's small speakers with impossible richness. The trail markers appeared exactly where they should be, leading clearly back to the parking area. My car waited in the empty lot, its digital clock showing a time that suggested I'd been in the forest for less than an hour, though my experience felt like it had lasted through the night. Driving home, I listened to the recordings again and again. The singing was beautiful, complex, and utterly impossible. No single human voice could produce such harmonies, yet the audio clearly showed a single source. When I had the files analyzed by a colleague in the music department, she confirmed what I already knew. The recordings showed multiple voices singing in perfect harmony, but the waveform analysis indicated a single acoustic source. I researched the brass plaque's inscription and found no records of its installation by the Whitmore Historical Society. The organization had no documentation of any memorial in that location, no knowledge of the circular clearing, no explanation for a marker they'd apparently erected, but never recorded. The hymn's melody haunted me for weeks. I found myself humming it unconsciously during lectures, catching my students staring as the unfamiliar tune emerged from my throat without my awareness. The harmonies I remembered seemed to sing themselves in my mind during quiet moments, filling the spaces between thoughts with their impossible beauty. 3 months later, on the date my phone had recorded during that impossible night, I received an email from the Whitmore Historical Society. They were planning to install a memorial marker in the park to commemorate an unnamed colonial settlement discovered through recent archaeological research. The proposed inscription matched exactly what I'd seen on the brass plaque. Here lies the voice of the faithful, who sing eternal in the spaces between silence. They wanted to consult with me about the historical accuracy of the marker's placement and text. The email included a preliminary site survey photograph of the proposed location, a circular clearing surrounded by trees arranged in perfect symmetry. I've never responded to that email. Some questions are more dangerous than the uncertainty they seek to resolve. But sometimes, late at night when the house is quiet, I can still hear them singing. Story 6. The ad in the paper had been modest, almost apologetic in its brevity. Night security position available. Quiet environment. Must be comfortable with insects. Apply in person. I'd been out of work for 3 months, burning through my savings while sending out resumes that disappeared into the digital void. The Whitmore Entomological Museum wasn't exactly what I'd envisioned when I'd gotten my degree in recreational therapy, but a paycheck was a paycheck. Dr. Whitmore himself had conducted the interview, a rail-thin man in his 70s whose fingers trembled slightly as he poured tea from a china set that looked older than the building itself. The museum occupied a converted Victorian mansion on the outskirts of town, its rooms filled with glass cases containing thousands of preserved specimens. Beetles arranged in perfect geometric patterns, butterflies pinned behind dusty glass, and in the basement level, the crown jewel of his collection, a massive ant farm that stretched across an entire wall. The position is quite simple, he'd explained, his voice carrying the faint accent of someone who'd spent decades in academia. The building has its quirks, you understand. Old electrical systems, settling foundations. Sometimes the climate control makes unusual sounds. Nothing to concern yourself with, merely the personality of an old building. The pay was surprisingly generous for what amounted to sitting in an empty museum for 8 hours. I'd accepted on the spot. My first week passed without incident. I'd established a routine. Arrive at 9 p.m., check the locks, walk through each floor to ensure everything was secure, then settle in the security office with a thermos of coffee and whatever book I'd brought. The building was indeed quiet, almost unnaturally so. Even in the heart of the city, most places retained some ambient noise, traffic, sirens, the hum of electrical systems. But inside the Whitmore Museum, silence seemed to pool in the corners like standing water. It was during my second week that I first heard the voices. I'd been reading in the security office, a cramped room tucked behind the main exhibition hall, when a sound drifted through the walls. At first, I dismissed it as the building's heating system, or perhaps a radio left on in a neighboring business. But as I listened more carefully, the sound resolved into something distinctly human, voices speaking in urgent, clipped tones. I set down my book and followed the sound through the darkened halls. My flashlight beam swept across display cases filled with mounted specimens, their glass eyes catching the light like tiny stars. The voices grew clearer as I descended to the basement level, though I couldn't make out individual words. They seemed to be speaking in a language I didn't recognize, or perhaps speaking too quickly for my ears to parse. The basement housed Dr. Whitmore's pride and joy, a formicarium that spanned nearly 15 feet of the eastern wall. The ant colony within was supposedly one of the largest in captivity, a complex civilization of tunnels and chambers, visible through the transparent panels. During the day, I'd watched the insects moving in constant streams, carrying food, tending larvae, expanding their architectural marvel grain by grain. Now, in the darkness of my night shift, they were still active. But something about their movement seemed different, more purposeful, more coordinated than the chaotic industry I'd observed before. They moved in distinct formations, creating patterns that shifted and evolved like a living language written in chitin and legs. The voices were coming from speakers mounted in the ceiling corners, though I couldn't locate any obvious sound system. The quality was strange, as if the audio was being transmitted through water or from a great distance. As I stood before the ant farm, straining to understand the words, I realized that the insect's movements seemed to synchronize with the rhythm of the speech. When I returned to the security office and called Dr. Whitmore's emergency number, he answered on the first ring despite the late hour. "Ah, you've noticed the broadcasts," he said, and I could hear the smile in his voice. "I should have mentioned those during your orientation." The previous night guard was quite concerned at first as well. I asked him about the speakers, about the language being broadcast, about why the ants seemed to be responding to the sounds. "Old building, as I mentioned. The wiring is rather complex. Sometimes radio signals get picked up by the climate control system. As for the ants, well, insects are remarkably sensitive to vibrations. I'm sure it's nothing more than coincidence. His explanation was perfectly reasonable, delivered in the calm, professorial tone I'd come to associate with him. But after I hung up, I found myself returning to the basement repeatedly throughout the night, drawn by a growing certainty that what I was witnessing was far from coincidental. Over the following days, I began to notice patterns that hadn't been apparent before. The broadcasts always began at exactly 1:47 a.m. and continued until 4:23 a.m. The language, if it was a language, contained recurring phonetic structures that suggested meaning rather than random radio interference. And the ants' behavior during these broadcasts was markedly different from their daytime activities. During the day, they moved with the efficient randomness of insects going about their biological imperatives. But at night, during the broadcasts, they arranged themselves in formations that resembled letters or symbols. Not English letters, but something more angular, more purposeful. The formations would hold for several minutes before dissolving and reforming into new configurations. I began bringing a notebook to work, documenting the sounds I heard and sketching the patterns I observed. The voices spoke in what sounded like military cadences, short, sharp commands followed by longer responses. Sometimes I could almost convince myself I understood a word or phrase, but the meaning would slip away the moment I tried to focus on it. On my third week, I decided to record one of the broadcasts. I positioned my phone near the speakers and let it run throughout the night. When I played back the recording the next morning, there was nothing but the ambient hum of the building's electrical systems. I tried again the following night, this time using a digital recorder I'd borrowed from a friend. Same result. 7 hours of near silence punctuated only by the occasional creak of settling wood. The absence of any recorded evidence should have been reassuring. Instead, it filled me with a creeping dread that seemed to settle in my chest like cold water. I found myself staying later each morning, reluctant to leave the museum and return to the ordinary world, where radio signals didn't spontaneously materialize from hidden speakers, and insects didn't arrange themselves into incomprehensible alphabets. Dr. Whitmore began appearing more frequently during my shifts, always with some plausible excuse. Forgotten research materials, equipment that needed checking, late-night inspiration for his latest paper. But I noticed he never visited during the broadcasts, always arriving just before or just after the voices filled the basement. During one of these visits, I asked him about the previous night guard, the one he'd mentioned during my first call. Hartley was with us for nearly 6 months, Dr. Whitmore said, adjusting his glasses as he examined a display case of tropical beetles. Reliable fellow, very dedicated to his duties. Unfortunately, he had to leave rather suddenly. Family obligations, you understand. When I pressed for more details, Dr. Whitmore's expression became guarded. Hartley became rather fixated on certain aspects of the position. He began to see patterns where none existed, to attribute significance to perfectly natural phenomena. It's not uncommon in night security work, the isolation, the darkness, the mind's tendency to create meaning from randomness. That night I paid closer attention to the ant formations. What I'd initially dismissed as pareidolia, the mind's tendency to find familiar shapes in random patterns, began to seem more deliberate. The insects weren't just moving randomly during the broadcasts. They were spelling something. The characters were angular and alien, but they possessed an undeniable structure. I spent hours copying the formations into my notebook, comparing them across different nights. Gradually, a pattern emerged. The same sequence of symbols appeared repeatedly, always in the same order, always held for the same duration. It was a word, or perhaps a name, repeated like a mantra throughout each broadcast. The revelation should have been thrilling, proof that what I was experiencing wasn't merely the product of isolation and overwork. Instead, it terrified me. The implications were too vast and too strange to process comfortably. If the ants were indeed spelling out messages in response to the mysterious broadcasts, what intelligence was guiding them? And what was the purpose of the endless repetition of that alien word? My sleep began to suffer. Even during the day, safe in my apartment with sunlight streaming through the windows, I found myself listening for the phantom voices. I would catch myself tapping out the rhythms I'd heard, or unconsciously sketching the angular symbols in the margins of newspapers and grocery lists. The breaking point came during my 4th week. I'd arrived for my shift to find the basement flooded with a warm, amber light that seemed to emanate from within the ant farm itself. The entire colony was in motion, every insect moving in perfect synchronization to form not just individual letters, but entire sentences written in that strange angular script. The broadcasts were different that night, too. Instead of the rapid-fire military cadences I'd grown accustomed to, the voices spoke slowly, deliberately, as if they knew they finally had an audience capable of understanding. And for the first time, I could make out individual words, not in any human language, but in something that bypassed my conscious mind and spoke directly to some deeper understanding. They were giving orders, instructions, a countdown of some kind, though counting toward what remained unclear. The ants responded to each directive with military precision, rearranging themselves into increasingly complex patterns that hurt to look at directly. I found myself standing at the base of the formicarium, my notebook forgotten, my pen frozen in my hand. The amber light pulsed in rhythm with my heartbeat, and the voices seemed to be speaking directly to me now, offering explanations that my rational mind couldn't accept, but that some primal part of my consciousness recognized as truth. The colony wasn't just responding to the broadcasts, it was participating in them. The ants were not mindless insects following chemical trails and biological imperatives. They were soldiers, organized and intelligent, receiving orders from a command structure that existed somewhere beyond the physical confines of their glass prison. And the word they spelled repeatedly, the name I'd been documenting with academic detachment for weeks, wasn't meaningless alien script. It was my name, rendered in a language older than human civilization, repeated like a summons or an invitation. When Dr. Whitmore arrived that morning, earlier than usual, he found me standing in the basement exactly where I'd been when the broadcasts ended at 4:23 a.m. He took one look at my face and nodded slowly, the way someone might nod upon receiving confirmation of long-held suspicions. "You've made contact," he said, and his voice carried neither surprise nor concern. "Hartley lasted 6 months. Patterson before him made it nearly 8. You're the quickest yet. Barely a month." I wanted to ask him about the other guards, about how many men had stood where I was standing, receiving the same terrible understanding that now occupied my thoughts like a living thing. But the questions seemed pointless, their answers already written in the careful way he avoided meeting my eyes. "The position comes with certain responsibilities," Dr. Whitmore continued, "obligations that extend beyond the simple security duties outlined in your initial interview. The colony requires a human intermediary, you understand, someone capable of receiving and interpreting their communications." He gestured toward the formicarium, where the ants had returned to their normal daytime activities, or what I'd once believed were normal activities. Now I could see the subtle patterns in their movement, the way they organized themselves in response to signals I was only beginning to perceive. "You have a choice, of course. You can leave, as Hartley did, as Patterson did before him. Return to your previous life and pretend this month never happened. Though I should warn you that the adjustment can be difficult. The broadcasts don't stop simply because you're no longer present to hear them." I thought about returning to my apartment, to job applications and unemployment benefits and the ordinary struggles of ordinary life. But the amber light still pulsed behind my eyes, and the alien symbols seemed burned into my retinas. The voices had found me, had chosen me, had taught me their language and shown me truths that couldn't be unseen. "Or," Dr. Whitmore said softly, "you can accept your role in this grand design. The colony has been patient, but their patience is not infinite. The countdown you witnessed tonight, they're preparing for something, and they need someone who can understand their needs, who can help them prepare." The morning light was beginning to filter through the basement windows, casting long shadows across the floor. Soon, the museum would open to the public, and visitors would file past the formicarium, marveling at the industrious insects behind the glass. They would see only what they expected to see. A colony of ants going about their biological imperatives, building their tunnels, tending their young. They wouldn't see the intelligence looking back at them through compound eyes. They wouldn't hear the voices that spoke through frequencies beyond human perception. They wouldn't understand that they were looking at soldiers preparing for a war that had been planned for millennia. I looked at Dr. Whitmore, at his tired eyes and trembling hands, and realized he'd been standing where I was standing once, decades ago. He'd made his choice and lived with the consequences, maintaining his role as curator and guardian, protecting the secret that lived in his basement. The notebook was still in my hand, filled with weeks of careful documentation, evidence of something that couldn't be explained but could no longer be denied. I thought about the other guards, about where they'd gone and what they'd become after walking away from this basement, and the truths it contained. Outside, the city was waking up. People were starting their cars, drinking their coffee, beginning another ordinary day in a world they believed they understood. They would never know how close they lived to something vast and patient and utterly alien. They would never hear the voices that spoke through impossible speakers, or see the messages spelled out in living script by creatures they dismissed as simple insects. The amber light had faded, but I could still feel its warmth behind my eyes. The voices had gone silent, but their echoes remained, promising to return with the next sunset. And somewhere in the depths of my mind, in places I'd never known existed, I could hear something that sounded remarkably like marching. The countdown had begun, and I was no longer merely a witness to whatever was coming. I was part of it now, linked to the colony by bonds I couldn't understand but could no longer ignore. The question wasn't whether I would stay. The broadcasts had already made that decision for me. The question was whether I was strong enough to carry the weight of what I'd learned, and what price I'd pay for becoming the intermediary between two worlds that were never meant to touch. Story 7. The Sunset Motor Lodge squatted against the Nevada highway like a dying animal, its neon sign flickering erratically in the desert twilight. Half the letters had burned out years ago, leaving only Suet-M or El Deej to welcome whatever desperate souls found themselves this far from civilization at this hour. I pulled my rental car into the gravel lot, the engine ticking as it cooled, and stared at the building's weathered facade. Paint peeled from its walls like sunburned skin, and several windows were boarded up with plywood that had warped and grayed under the relentless sun. The desk clerk emerged from behind a curtain of hanging beads, his movements suggesting he'd been dozing. He was a thin man with hollow cheeks and eyes that seemed to look through me rather than at me. When I asked for a room, he glanced at a register that appeared to contain more dust than entries. "Got one available," he said, his voice carrying the rasp of too many cigarettes. "Room 12. Fair warning, though. It's been out of service for maintenance. Hasn't been rented in a while." The exhaustion weighing on my shoulders made the decision easy. I'd been driving for 16 hours straight, and the next town was another 100 miles through desert that stretched like an ocean of sand and scrub. The clerk seemed reluctant as he handed over the key, his fingers lingering on the metal longer than necessary. "Checkout's at 11, he said, then added quietly, "Try not to mind the noise." I wanted to ask what he meant, but fatigue had settled into my bones like lead, and all I could think about was horizontal surfaces and darkness. The room was at the far end of the motel, isolated from the few other occupied units by a stretch of empty doors and darkened windows. The key turned with surprising ease, and I pushed inside. The smell hit me first, not the usual motel cocktail of disinfectant and stale cigarettes, but something earthier, like damp soil after rain. The room was clean enough, though clearly showing its age. The wallpaper had faded to an indeterminate color, somewhere between beige and yellow, and the carpet bore the kind of stains that told stories no one wanted to hear. But it was the clock on the far wall that caught my attention. It was an old railroad-style timepiece with a white face and bold black numbers, the kind you'd expect to find in a train station from decades past. The hands pointed to 11:47, which seemed about right. though I was too tired to check my phone for confirmation. Something about it felt wrong, but I couldn't place what. I dropped my duffel bag on the bed and went through the motions of settling in. The bathroom mirror was spotted with age, reflecting a distorted version of myself that looked older and more worn than I remembered. The faucet dripped with metronomic persistence, each drop echoing in the small space with surprising volume. Sleep came quickly despite the unfamiliar surroundings, pulling me down into darkness with the weight of accumulated exhaustion. But it wasn't the peaceful rest I'd hoped for. I found myself standing in what appeared to be the same room, though everything felt different. The walls seemed closer, pressing in with a subtle malevolence that made my skin crawl. The carpet beneath my feet was damp, as if recently flooded, and the air carried a metallic taste that coated my tongue. In the corner where the bathroom door should have been stood a figure. He was an older man, maybe 60, with silver hair that had once been carefully combed, but now hung in disheveled strands across his forehead. His face was deeply lined, weathered by years of outdoor work, and his clothes, faded overalls and a flannel shirt, hung loose on his frame. But it was what he was missing that drew my attention with horrific fascination. His left arm ended abruptly at the shoulder, the sleeve of his shirt pinned up in the way that suggested the absence was old, familiar. He stood perfectly still, watching me with eyes that held a desperate kind of patience, as if he'd been waiting for years for this moment. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of countless repetitions, like an actor who'd performed the same line so many times it had lost all meaning, except as a vehicle for deeper longing. "What time is it?" The question hung in the air between us, and I felt compelled to answer, though I couldn't see a clock anywhere in the dream-distorted room. The words came from my mouth without conscious thought. "It's 11:49. The man's face crumpled with what might have been relief or despair. In the strange logic of dreams, both emotions seemed equally valid. He nodded once, a gesture so filled with gratitude that it made my chest tight, and then began to fade like smoke dispersing in a breeze. I woke with the abruptness of someone falling, my heart hammering against my ribs and sweat cooling on my skin despite the room's chill. The digital clock on the nightstand read 3:23 a.m., its red numbers glowing like eyes in the darkness. But when I looked at the wall clock, my breath caught in my throat. The hands pointed to 11:47, exactly 2 minutes before the time I'd given the man in my dream. I lay there for several minutes, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. Perhaps the clock was broken, stuck at that time through some mechanical failure. But as I watched, the minute hand began to move. Backward. It crept counterclockwise with deliberate precision, each tick audible in the room's silence. 11:46, 11:45, 11:44. The movement was wrong in a way that went beyond mere mechanical malfunction. It possessed an intentionality that made my skin crawl, as if the clock was actively working to achieve some specific purpose. I got up and walked closer, studying the timepiece in the dim light filtering through the curtains. There was nothing obviously damaged about it, no visible signs of tampering or age-related failure. When I touched the wall beneath it, the surface felt warm, as if heated from within. The sensation traveled up my arm like a mild electric current, not painful, but definitely present. I jerked my hand back and noticed that my fingers tingled for several seconds afterward. Sleep became impossible after that. I spent the remaining hours until dawn sitting in the room's single chair, watching the clock continue its backward march. By the time pale light began seeping around the edges of the curtains, the hands pointed to 11:38. The mathematical precision was undeniable. Exactly 11 minutes had passed in reverse since I'd first noticed the phenomenon. At 7 a.m., I gave up any pretense of rest and went to find the desk clerk. The morning light revealed more of the motel's decay. Parking spaces where weeds pushed through cracked asphalt, a swimming pool that had been drained and abandoned so long ago that tumbleweeds had collected in its deep end. The office door stood open, but the space behind the counter was empty. I called out, my voice echoing in the small space, but received no response. A handwritten sign taped to the register read, Back in 10 minutes, though the paper looked yellowed with age. While waiting, I examined the guest registry, flipping through pages that showed increasingly sparse entries as I went back in time. The last entry before mine was dated 3 weeks ago. What struck me as odd was that every previous guest had stayed in a different room. Room 7, Room 3, Room 15, but never Room 12. The space where that room number should have appeared in the various entries was consistently blank, as if the room didn't exist in the clerk system. When the clerk finally returned, carrying a steaming cup of coffee that smelled better than anything had a right to in this place, I asked him about the clock in my room. Clock? He set down his cup and looked at me with the same hollow expression he'd worn the night before. Can't say I recall any particular clock. The railroad clock on the wall, it's running backward. His pause lasted long enough to feel uncomfortable. Probably just needs new batteries. These old places, you know how it is. Things don't always work the way they're supposed to. But his eyes suggested he knew exactly what I was talking about, and that new batteries wouldn't solve the problem. I pressed him for more information about the room's history, about why it had been out of service, but he became increasingly evasive. Eventually, he retreated behind the curtain of beads, leaving me alone with my questions, and a growing sense that I was missing something crucial. Back in the room, the clock showed 11:31. I decided to conduct an experiment, setting my phone's stopwatch and observing the wall clock for exactly 1 hour. The results confirmed my worst suspicions. As 60 minutes passed in the real world, the clock moved backward by 60 minutes, maintaining its steady retreat toward some unknown destination. The implications made my head spin. If the pattern held, the clock would reach 11:47 again at exactly 11:47 p.m., 24 hours after I'd first noticed the phenomenon. What would happen then? Would it reset? Continue backward past 11? Or would something else occur? Something connected to the dream and the one-armed man who seemed to exist in the spaces between sleeping and waking. I tried to leave twice that day. The first time I packed my bag and walked to the car, but found myself unable to turn the key. My hands shook with an anxiety I couldn't explain, and the desert beyond the parking lot seemed to stretch infinitely in all directions. The second attempt came after lunch, but as I approached the highway, a wave of vertigo struck me so forcefully that I had to pull over and wait for it to pass. Something was keeping me here. Whether supernatural compulsion or psychological breakdown, I couldn't say. The distinction seemed increasingly meaningless as the day wore on. The afternoon brought a different kind of horror, the gradual realization that I was being watched. It started as a feeling, that familiar itch between the shoulder blades that suggests unseen eyes. But as the hours passed, the sensation intensified until I could barely function. I found myself checking the room's corners obsessively, peering behind furniture and into spaces too small to hide anything larger than a mouse. The feeling was strongest near the clock, as if whatever presence I sensed was connected to that backward-flowing timepiece. When I stood directly beneath it, the air seemed to thicken, becoming harder to breathe. The warmth I'd felt in the wall the night before had spread, creating a zone of elevated temperature that extended several feet in all directions. At 4 p.m., I called my brother in Phoenix, desperate for contact with the normal world. But even as I dialed, I knew I wouldn't be able to explain what was happening. How do you tell someone that time is moving backward in your hotel room? That you're being watched by something you can't see? That a one-armed man from your dreams might be more real than the reality you've always trusted? The conversation was brief and unsatisfying. My brother's voice sounded distant, as if he were speaking from the bottom of a well, and our connection kept cutting out at crucial moments. When I hung up, I felt more isolated than before. Evening arrived with the subtlety of a predator stalking its prey. The desert sky faded from blue to purple to black, and the motel's few functioning lights created small pools of illumination that only made the surrounding darkness seem deeper. Inside the room, I waited with the patience of someone who knows they're about to learn something they don't want to know. At 11:45 p.m., the clock hands pointed to 11:49, 2 minutes until they reached the time I'd spoken in my dream. I sat in the chair facing the clock, my hands gripping the armrests hard enough to leave marks in the vinyl. 11:46 p.m. The clock showed 11:48. My chest felt tight, as if the air in the room was being slowly extracted. The temperature continued to rise, and sweat beaded on my forehead despite the evening's chill. Something was building, gathering itself like a storm preparing to break. 11:47 p.m. The clock read 11:47. Time stopped, not metaphorically, not in the sense of a moment seeming to last forever. Time actually stopped. The digital display on my phone froze mid-change. The drip from the bathroom faucet ceased mid-fall. Even my own heartbeat seemed suspended between one beat and the next. In that impossible moment of stillness, the one-armed man appeared. He didn't fade in like smoke this time. 1 second the corner was empty. The next he stood there as solid and real as the furniture around him. His eyes met mine with an intensity that made my soul feel naked, exposed to scrutiny by something far older and more patient than human consciousness. "What time is it?" he asked, and his voice carried the weight of every repetition, every night, every dreamer who had passed through this room and been asked the same question. I opened my mouth to speak, knowing the answer he wanted, knowing that I was part of a pattern that stretched back years or maybe decades. But before I could respond, understanding crashed over me like a wave. He wasn't asking for the time. He was asking for his time, the moment he'd lost, the instant that had been stolen from him and scattered across countless nights and countless dreamers. Each person who stayed in this room became a repository for a fragment of his stolen moment, and the clock measured not the passage of time but its return. 11:49, I said, and the words felt like releasing a held breath. The man's face transformed with an emotion too complex for words. Relief mixed with sorrow, gratitude tinged with loss. He nodded once, the same gesture from my dream, and began to fade. But this time, I understood what I was witnessing, not disappearance, but completion. Time resumed with a sensation like falling from a great height. My phone's display continued its change. The faucet completed its drip. My heart hammered out its suspended beat. When I looked at the wall clock, the hands pointed to 11:47, but something fundamental had changed. The movement was normal now, forward, following the natural flow of moments from past to future. I left the next morning without seeing the desk clerk, sliding the key under his door along with payment for 2 nights. As I drove away, I glanced back once at the Sunset Motor Lodge. In the bright morning light, it looked exactly like what it was, a rundown motel in the middle of nowhere, the kind of place people end up when they're running from something or running towards something or just running. But I knew that room 12 would be rented again, eventually. Another traveler would find themselves drawn to that particular space, and another dream would begin. The pattern would continue, because some debts can only be paid in installments, spread across time and consciousness, like interest on a loan that can never be fully satisfied. I still dream about the one-armed man sometimes. Not the desperate figure I met in that room, but someone at peace, whole in ways that have nothing to do with missing limbs. In those dreams, he never asks what time it is. He already knows. And sometimes, late at night when sleep eludes me, I wonder if what I experienced was real, or if something inside my mind simply broke for a few hours in that desert motel room. The distinction seems less important now than it once did. Reality is more fragile than we like to believe, and time is stranger than we can possibly imagine. The only thing I know for certain is that I'll never again look at a clock without remembering that some moments aren't meant to pass, and some questions aren't meant to be answered by the people who hear them first. Story 8. The first call came on a Tuesday, slicing through the dinner rush like a blade through raw meat. I was manning the grill at Esperanza, my modest restaurant tucked between a laundromat and a discount electronics store on the east side of town. Steam rose from searing chicken thighs while I coordinated orders, sweat beading on my forehead despite the industrial fans churning overhead. The phone, my business line, buzzed against my hip with an incoming call. Without looking at the screen, I pressed the device to my ear while flipping meat with my free hand. The line crackled with static, then settled into an unnatural silence that made my skin crawl. No ambient noise, no breathing, nothing. Just a void that seemed to pull at my eardrums. Then, a voice. Male, flat, emotionless as a recorded announcement. Return to the bunker. The words hit me like ice water. My spatula clattered to the floor and I nearly dropped the phone. The accent was unmistakably from my homeland, the same clipped consonants and rolling vowels I'd spent years trying to soften in my own speech. But something about the intonation felt wrong, mechanical, as if the words were being assembled rather than spoken. I pulled the phone away to check the caller ID. The screen displayed an impossibly long string of numbers, country codes I didn't recognize, digits that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. The GPS icon in the corner spun endlessly, unable to locate the source. The line went dead. For the rest of that evening, I moved through my kitchen routines on autopilot, my mind circling those 4 words like a dog returning to a wound. Return to the bunker. The phrase meant nothing to me. I'd never been in a bunker, never lived anywhere that required underground shelter. My childhood had been spent in cramped apartments and my grandmother's small house with its garden full of herbs I now used in my cooking. But the voice, that voice carried weight, familiarity, as if it belonged to someone I should remember. Sleep eluded me that night. I lay in my studio apartment above the restaurant, listening to the building settle around me. Every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the pipes, sounded like footsteps. The shadows cast by streetlights through my window seemed to move independently, reaching across my walls with grasping fingers. The second call arrived 3 days later during the lunch prep. This time, I was ready. I'd been checking my phone obsessively, studying every incoming number, but when it rang, the screen showed the same incomprehensible sequence of digits. My hands shook as I answered. Again, that terrible silence. Then, return to the bunker. The voice was identical, not similar, but exactly the same inflection, the same pause between words, as if it were a recording playing on loop. This time I tried to respond, to demand who was calling and what they wanted, but the words stuck in my throat like bones. Something about that voice commanded silence, respect, obedience. I hung up and immediately tried calling the number back. Each attempt resulted in the same error message. The number you have dialed cannot be completed as called. When I took the phone to my service provider later that day, they insisted no calls had been logged to my number during those times. Their system showed no record of the mysterious communications. The clerk, a tired-looking woman with glasses that reflected the fluorescent lights, examined my phone with professional detachment. She suggested stress, overwork, maybe a software glitch. Her explanations felt thin as tissue paper, but I nodded and left, carrying my phone like a loaded weapon. That weekend, I decided to close the restaurant early and drive out to the lake where I used to fish when I first arrived in this country. The 40-minute journey through winding country roads usually calmed my nerves, but as I drove, I noticed a sedan in my rearview mirror maintaining the same distance regardless of my speed. When I slowed, it slowed. When I accelerated around curves, it matched my pace perfectly. The car was too far behind to make out the driver, but something about its persistence made my mouth go dry. I turned onto a side road that led to a scenic overlook, expecting the sedan to continue straight. Instead, it followed, maintaining that same measured distance. At the overlook, I parked and pretended to admire the view while watching the road. The sedan had vanished, as if it had never existed. The only sounds were wind through pine needles and the distant hum of highway traffic. I spent an hour by the water, skipping stones and trying to convince myself I was imagining things. The phone rang as I climbed back into my car. This time I didn't answer. I let it ring until it stopped, then checked the screen. Same impossible number. No voicemail. But as I sat there staring at the display, a new message appeared. Not a text, but a GPS coordinate that seemed to burn itself into the screen. My hands moved without conscious direction, entering the coordinates into my navigation app. The destination appeared as a location about 2 hours south, in a part of the state I'd never visited. The map showed nothing but forest and a small road that seemed to lead nowhere. I drove home instead, but the coordinates haunted me. That night, I researched the location online, finding only vague references to abandoned military installations and forgotten government projects from decades past. Historical records were sparse, buried in digitized archives that required special permissions to access. The calls came more frequently after that. Always the same voice, always the same message, always at moments when I was alone and vulnerable. During my morning coffee while restocking supplies, in the quiet hour before dawn when I prepped vegetables for the day ahead. Each time, the phone's GPS would spin helplessly, unable to trace the source. I began to notice other things. Customers who seemed to watch me too intently, their eyes following my movements around the kitchen through the service window. Cars parked outside my restaurant for hours without anyone getting in or out. Shadows that appeared and disappeared at the edge of my vision, always just beyond the reach of direct sight. My sleep deteriorated further. I would lie awake, hyper-aware of every sound in the building below. Sometimes I thought I heard footsteps in the restaurant after hours, the soft squeak of shoes on tile. But when I crept downstairs to investigate, I found only empty dining room tables and the gleam of moonlight on stainless steel. The breaking point came on a Thursday evening, exactly 2 weeks after the first call. I was closing up, wiping down counters and securing the register, when the phone rang. This time, I answered immediately, my voice harsh with frustration and exhaustion. "What do you want from me?" The usual silence stretched between us, but this time it felt different, expectant, as if the caller was pleased I'd finally engaged. When the voice came, it carried new layers of meaning, harmonics that seemed to resonate in my bones. "Return to the bunker, Miguel." My name. The voice knew my name, spoke it with the same mechanical precision, but somehow made it sound like a prayer, a threat, a memory just beyond recall. The line went dead, leaving me standing alone in my darkened restaurant, surrounded by the ghosts of meals prepared and conversations shared. That night I packed a bag. I couldn't explain the compulsion, couldn't rationalize the decision, but I knew I had to follow those coordinates. The drive south began in darkness, my headlights cutting through pre-dawn fog that seemed to swirl with purpose rather than drift randomly. The GPS led me through increasingly rural areas, past farms and forests that looked ancient in the half-light. As I drove, fragments of memory began surfacing, not clear recollections but impressions, feelings, the sense that I'd traveled this route before. The landscape felt familiar in a way that made my chest tight with inexplicable anxiety. The coordinates led to a dirt road barely wide enough for my car, flanked by no trespassing signs weathered by decades of exposure. I drove slowly, branches scraping against my windows, until the path ended at a small clearing, dominated by a concrete structure half buried in the hillside. A bunker. It looked abandoned, its entrance sealed with a metal door that had rusted to the color of dried blood. Vines and moss covered most of the visible concrete, but I could make out faded numbers stenciled near the door. Numbers that matched part of the impossible phone number that had been calling me. I sat in my car for what felt like hours, engine running, heat blasting against the morning chill. The bunker squatted in the clearing like a sleeping beast, and I had the overwhelming sense that something inside was waiting for me, had been waiting for a very long time. My phone buzzed. Same number, same silence. But this time the voice that emerged carried unmistakable satisfaction. "You're home." As the words faded, I noticed movement at the bunker's entrance. The rusted door was opening, not quickly, but with deliberate mechanical precision, revealing darkness beyond. No one was operating it. It simply opened as if responding to some distant signal. A smell reached me through my closed car windows. Metal and earth and something else. Something organic that spoke to parts of my brain I'd rather keep sleeping. With the smell came a sound, not quite voices, but a rhythmic pattern like breathing, like dozens of people synchronized in sleep. The rational part of my mind screamed warnings, demanded I drive away, call the police, seek help from anyone who would listen. But another part, a part that felt older and more certain, recognized this place. It whispered that I had been here before, that the calls weren't summoning me to somewhere new, but calling me back to where I'd always belonged. I turned off the engine. The silence that followed was complete, absolute, broken only by that rhythmic breathing from within the bunker. My phone showed no signal, no GPS, nothing but the time. 6:23 a.m. As I stepped out of the car, footsteps echoed from the bunker's depths, multiple sets, moving in unison, approaching the entrance. The sound was familiar, comforting in a way that terrified me. I realized I was walking toward the door, my feet moving without conscious command, drawn by something stronger than fear or reason. Behind me, my car door stood open, keys dangling from the ignition. In front of me, the bunker entrance yawned like an open mouth, and from its depths came the voice that had been calling me. But now I could hear it clearly, not from my phone, but from my own throat, speaking words I didn't remember choosing. "Welcome home, Miguel." The darkness reached out to embrace me, and as it did, I wondered if I had ever really left this place at all, or if everything else, the restaurant, the life I'd built, the man I thought I was, had been the real dream, finally coming to an end. The last thing I saw before the darkness claimed me completely was my reflection in the bunker's metal door. Not the face of a chef, not the face of an immigrant who had built a new life, but the face of someone who had always belonged here, who had simply been away far too long. The door closed behind me, with a sound like a sigh, and somewhere in the distance, a phone began to ring. Story 9. The sledgehammer felt heavier with each swing, but the satisfaction of destruction kept my arms moving. 37 years of water damage and neglect had turned my grandmother's bathroom into a breeding ground for rot, and I was finally doing something about it. The ceramic tiles shattered like brittle promises, sending jagged fragments skittering across the subfloor in a percussion of progress. I paused to wipe sweat from my forehead, the October air thick with dust and the musty odor of decades-old moisture. The house had been sitting empty since her death 6 months ago, and the real estate agent had been brutally honest about its condition. But I was an engineer, not some weekend warrior with a YouTube education. I knew what needed to be done. The final section of flooring came up with a satisfying crack, exposing the subflooring beneath. That's when I saw it. A hairline fissure running parallel to the joists, barely visible in the dim light filtering through the grimy window. At first glance, it appeared to be nothing more than settling damage, the kind of minor issue you'd expect in a house built in 1952. I knelt down, running my fingers along the gap, less than 5 centimeters wide, maybe 3 at its widest point. Standard foundation settlement. I'd seen dozens of similar cracks in my 20 years of structural engineering. Nothing that couldn't be handled with some expansion foam and a fresh subfloor. But then I caught it. Just a whisper at first. So faint I almost convinced myself it was imagination. The unmistakable aroma of freshly brewed coffee, rich and dark, with notes of chocolate and earth that spoke of expensive beans and careful preparation. The kind of coffee my grandmother had never owned the equipment to make. I sat back on my heels, inhaling deeply. The scent was definitely coming from the crack, rising like invisible smoke from whatever space existed beneath the floor. My rational mind immediately began cataloging possibilities. Old spills that had somehow preserved their odor, a neighbor's ventilation system with an unexpected route, perhaps even a broken water line that had created some strange chemical reaction with the soil. But the bathroom had been gutted for 3 days now, and this was the first time I'd noticed anything unusual. More troubling was the certainty in my nose that this wasn't some phantom scent preserved in old wood and insulation. This was fresh coffee, the kind that suggested someone had just finished brewing a pot. I stood up, dusting off my knees, and tried to shake the unease settling into my shoulders like a familiar jacket. The house had been empty for months. I had the only key. The coffee smell was just something else, something explainable. The next morning, I returned with a shop vacuum and a heavy-duty flashlight, determined to investigate the crack more thoroughly. The October sun struggled through the bathroom window, casting long shadows that seemed to dance independently of their sources. I'd slept poorly, waking several times with the phantom scent of coffee in my nostrils, though my apartment smelled only of paint fumes and the Chinese takeout I'd forgotten to throw away. I positioned myself over the crack and clicked on the flashlight. The beam penetrated perhaps 6 inches before being swallowed by an impenetrable darkness that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. I angled the light differently, trying to catch some detail of what lay beneath, but the darkness remained absolute. The coffee aroma was stronger today, so intense it made my mouth water despite my growing anxiety. I found myself breathing more deeply than necessary, drawing the scent into my lungs like a smoker savoring a cigarette. There was something almost narcotic about it, a richness that seemed to bypass my nose entirely and speak directly to some primitive part of my brain. I tried the shop vacuum, thinking perhaps I could clear away whatever debris was blocking my view. The motor roared to life, and I positioned the hose over the crack. The suction was powerful enough to lift small pieces of insulation and dust, but nothing substantial emerged. What disturbed me was the sound the vacuum made as it worked, a subtle change in pitch that suggested it was drawing air from a space much larger than the narrow gap would indicate. When I switched off the vacuum, the silence that followed felt heavy and expectant. And in that silence, I heard something that made my blood pressure spike. The distant but unmistakable sound of liquid pouring, as if someone far below was filling a cup from a coffee pot. I pressed my ear to the floor, ignoring the absurdity of my position. The sound was definitely there, rhythmic and purposeful. Pour, pause, pour again. Then what might have been the soft clink of ceramic against ceramic, followed by a satisfied sigh that was so human and so close that I jerked my head up and spun around, certain someone had entered the bathroom behind me. I was alone. The next 3 days blurred together in a haze of obsessive investigation. I called the city planning office to request the original blueprints, hoping to identify any underground utilities or forgotten infrastructure that might explain the anomaly. The elderly clerk who handled my request seemed genuinely puzzled by my questions about sub-basement spaces and utility tunnels. According to every official record, my grandmother's house sat on a simple concrete slab foundation with no basement, no crawl space, and no underground features whatsoever. I hired a local contractor to bring ground-penetrating radar equipment, telling him I suspected a sinkhole was developing beneath the foundation. The GPR scan revealed exactly what the city records had promised: solid earth extending down at least 15 feet, with no voids, no cavities, and no spaces large enough to accommodate whatever was producing the coffee aroma and the sounds I was increasingly certain I wasn't imagining. But the smell grew stronger each day, and with it came other sensations that were harder to dismiss as tricks of an overworked mind. Sometimes, when I knelt by the crack in the late afternoon, I could feel warm air rising from the gap, carrying with it not just the scent of coffee but other odors: vanilla, cinnamon, occasionally the yeasty sweetness of fresh baking bread. These were kitchen smells, domestic and comforting, emerging from a space that shouldn't exist beneath a bathroom floor. More disturbing were the sounds. The coffee pouring had become a regular occurrence, always around 3 in the afternoon, as predictable as a church bell. But now I was hearing other things: the soft shuffle of footsteps on what sounded like hardwood floors, the gentle closing of cabinet doors, and once, just once, what I could have sworn was humming. A woman's voice carrying a melody I didn't recognize, but that filled me with a longing so acute it brought tears to my eyes. I began spending entire days at the house, ostensibly working on other renovation projects, but actually finding excuses to return to the bathroom. I installed a small camping chair and positioned it near the crack, telling myself I was monitoring the situation scientifically, taking notes on the frequency and intensity of the phenomena. My notebook filled with observations that would have concerned me if I'd been capable of objective self-reflection. 2:47 p.m., coffee smell intensified, accompanied by what sounds like newspaper pages turning. 3:15 p.m., warm air current definitely present, temperature approximately 75 and 80 degrees. 4:22 p.m., heard what might be radio playing very quietly, possibly classical music. I stopped answering calls from friends and colleagues, The renovation project that was supposed to take 2 weeks stretched into its fourth week, with nothing to show for it but a destroyed bathroom and pages of increasingly frantic handwriting. I told myself I was being thorough, investigating a potentially dangerous structural issue that could affect the house's value. But I knew I was lying. The truth was that I had become addicted to the crack in the floor, to the impossible domestic symphony rising from the void beneath my grandmother's bathroom. I would arrive each morning with a thermos of my own coffee, bitter instant stuff that tasted like cardboard compared to whatever was being brewed in the space below, and spend hours listening to the ghost life happening in a place that couldn't exist. The breakthrough, if it could be called that, came on a Thursday evening in early November. I had been sitting by the crack for nearly 4 hours, my notebook balanced on my knee, when I heard something that stopped my breath. The distant but unmistakable sound of a telephone ringing. Not a modern cell phone's electronic chirp, but the honest brass bell of an old rotary phone, the kind my grandmother had kept in her kitchen until the day she died. The ringing stopped after 6 rings, followed by the click of someone answering. I couldn't make out words, but I could hear the rhythm of conversation, the rise and fall of a woman's voice speaking in warm, animated tones. She laughed at something, a sound so genuine and joyful that I found myself smiling in response. Then I heard something that sent ice water through my veins. The woman said something that ended with a sound I knew. My name. Just the last syllable, but unmistakable. She was talking about me. I pressed my ear harder against the floor, straining to hear more, but the conversation had ended. The silence that followed was different from before, not empty, but expectant, as if someone below was listening just as intently as I was. I began to speak to the crack. At first, just tentative whispers. Hello? Can you hear me? When there was no response, I grew bolder, sharing details about the renovation, about my plans for the house, about my grandmother, and the memories I had of visiting her as a child. I told the crack about my job, my failed marriage, my growing certainty that I was losing my mind in the most pleasant way possible. The responses were subtle but definite. When I spoke, the coffee smell would intensify, as if whoever was below was paying closer attention. Sometimes I heard what might have been footsteps moving closer to my position. Once, when I mentioned being hungry, the aroma of fresh bread became so overwhelming that I had to leave the bathroom to avoid fainting. I started bringing offerings, fresh flowers that I placed around the crack, small trinkets from my grandmother's house that I thought might be appreciated. The next day, the flowers would be gone, not wilted or dried, but simply vanished, leaving only their faint perfume mixed with the ever-present coffee scent. My rational mind staged regular rebellions against this new reality. I would drive home in the evening, convinced I had suffered some kind of breakdown, planning to call a therapist and have the crack professionally sealed. But each morning found me back at the house, drawn by a gravitational pull that felt stronger than logic or self-preservation. The investigation tools multiplied. Thermal imaging cameras that detected no heat signatures, sensitive microphones that picked up only the sounds I was already hearing, and air quality monitors that detected no unusual chemical signatures despite the overwhelming olfactory evidence. Every device confirmed that nothing unusual was happening beneath my grandmother's bathroom floor. 3 weeks into November, the phenomena began to change. The domestic sounds became more frequent and more intimate. Shower water running, hairdryer humming, the soft rustle of clothing being folded. These were bathroom sounds, as if the impossible space below had rearranged itself to mirror the room above. Sometimes I heard what sounded like makeup containers being opened and closed, the whispered friction of a brush against skin. More troubling was my growing certainty that I was being watched, not malevolently, but with the intense attention of someone studying a fascinating specimen. When I worked near the crack, the hair on the back of my neck would rise, and I would find myself glancing over my shoulder at shadows that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. I began to leave questions written on small pieces of paper, weighted down with stones near the crack. Who are you? What do you want? How long have you been here? The papers would disappear overnight, though I never found evidence of how they were being taken. Wind seemed an inadequate explanation for papers vanishing from inside a closed house. The responses came in dreams that felt more real than my waking hours. I would see a woman with my grandmother's hands, but a younger face, moving through rooms that resembled my grandmother's house but were somehow more colorful, more warm, more alive than the faded reality I remembered. In these dreams, she would pour coffee into delicate china cups and smile at me with eyes that held depths I couldn't fathom. She never spoke in the dreams, but I understood that she had been waiting, not just for weeks or months, but for years, decades even, for someone to notice the crack, to hear the sounds, to breathe in the coffee-scented air that was her only means of communication with the world above. When I woke from these dreams, the taste of perfect coffee would linger on my tongue for hours. December arrived with an early snowfall that left the house feeling more isolated than ever. I had stopped pretending to work on any other part of the renovation. My days consisted entirely of sitting beside the crack, notebook in hand, documenting every sound, every scent, every subtle change in temperature or air pressure. My handwriting had deteriorated into an increasingly frantic scrawl that I sometimes couldn't read when I tried to review my notes. The phenomena were reaching a crescendo that both thrilled and terrified me. I could now hear not just coffee being poured, but entire meals being prepared. The sizzle of eggs in a pan, the pop of toast emerging from a toaster, the scrape of utensils against plates. These were breakfast sounds, rich and homey, but they occurred at all hours of the day and night, as if time moved differently in the space below. I found myself synchronizing my own meals with the sounds from the crack, eating when I heard eating, brewing coffee when the coffee aroma peaked. This wasn't conscious decision-making. It happened automatically, as if I were being gently programmed by repetition and proximity. The dreams became more frequent and more detailed. The woman was no longer alone in them. Sometimes I saw shadowy figures moving in the background. Other people, or perhaps the same person at different stages of life. The house in my dreams was full of voices and laughter, the warm chaos of a family home that had never known emptiness or silence. But when I woke, I was always alone in my grandmother's cold, half-demolished bathroom, staring at a crack in the floor that logic insisted could not contain the universe of sound and scent that seemed to pour from it endlessly. On December 15th, 3 months after first discovering the crack, I made a decision that felt both inevitable and terrifying. I would enlarge the opening. If there was something beneath the floor, I would find it. If I was losing my mind, I would at least have definitive proof of my mental breakdown. I positioned my smallest sledgehammer carefully, aiming for the narrow gap. But as I raised the tool, the coffee aroma became so intense that it was like breathing liquid caffeine. The air around the crack shimmered with heat waves that shouldn't have existed in the cold December air. And from below came a sound that stopped me cold. Rapid, desperate knocking, as if someone was pounding on the underside of the floor trying to warn me away. I lowered the hammer, my hands shaking. The knocking stopped immediately, replaced by a silence so complete it felt like a held breath. Then, rising from the crack like a prayer, came the sound of sobbing. Quiet, heartbroken, and utterly human. I knelt beside the gap and whispered the question that had been growing in my mind for weeks. Are you trapped? The sobbing stopped. The silence stretched for so long that I began to think I had imagined the entire exchange. Then, so softly I might have convinced myself it was the wind, if I hadn't been listening with every cell in my body, came a single word. Yes. I sit here now, writing this account as snow falls past the bathroom window, the crack still unopened at my feet. The coffee smell has faded to barely a whisper, and the sounds from below have stopped entirely. I think my question frightened her, or me, or whatever mechanism in my brain has been generating this elaborate hallucination for the past 3 months. Tomorrow I will either swing the sledgehammer and discover what lies beneath my grandmother's bathroom floor, or I will call a psychiatric professional and begin the long process of putting my mind back together. Tonight, I honestly don't know which outcome terrifies me more. The only certainty is that I can no longer tell the difference between salvation and madness, between the impossible and the inevitable. All I know is that somewhere in the darkness below, someone is waiting for my decision, breathing the scent of perfect coffee into a world that insists she cannot exist. And in the growing silence, I'm beginning to suspect that maybe existence was never the right question to ask. Story 10. The first marble rolled at 2:47 a.m. I know the exact time because I'd been staring at the clock on my monitor, waiting for the render to finish. 3 hours into what should have been a quick audio polish for the new level, and my eyes burned from the blue glow of too many open windows. The apartment was tomb quiet except for the persistent hum of my workstation's fans and the distant rumble of late-night traffic 7 floors below. Then I heard it, a distinct, deliberate roll across the wooden surface of my desk. Glass against grain, smooth and measured, like someone had placed a marble at one edge and let gravity guide it to the other. I lifted my head from my hands and scanned the cluttered workspace. Empty energy drink cans, scattered USB drives, a tangle of audio cables, and my mechanical keyboard with its missing spacebar cap, but no marbles. Nothing that could roll. Nothing that could make that sound. The render completed with a soft chime, and I exported the file automatically, muscle memory guiding my fingers through the familiar sequence. As soon as the progress bar disappeared, the rolling sound returned. Deliberate, unhurried, right to left across the exact center of my desk. My chair creaked as I leaned back, the leather worn smooth from countless late nights like this one. The sound stopped immediately, as if responding to my movement. I remained motionless for several minutes, listening to the building's nocturnal symphony, pipes settling, neighbors shifting in their sleep, the elevator's occasional mechanical sigh. But no more rolling. I returned to work, loading the next audio file into my editing software. The game's publisher had moved the deadline up by a week, and I'd been pulling 16-hour days to compensate. The stress was getting to me, clearly. Auditory hallucinations weren't uncommon among people suffering from sleep deprivation and excessive caffeine intake. I'd read about it in some forum thread months ago, but when I closed the audio program to check my email, the rolling returned. This time it was unmistakable. Not one marble, but several, maybe 3 or 4, cascading across the desk in lazy succession. Each one distinct in pitch and duration, like notes in a melody I couldn't quite grasp. The sound seemed to originate from the exact spot where my monitor's base met the wooden surface, traveling in a perfect arc toward the far edge where my coffee mug sat cold and forgotten. I opened the audio software again. Silence. Closed it. Rolling. My hands trembled slightly as I repeated the action, timing the correlation. Software open. Nothing. Software closed. The unmistakable sound of glass spheres finding their paths across my workspace. The pattern held for 5 consecutive tests before I forced myself to stop. The logical explanations lined up like dominoes in my mind. Stress-induced hallucinations, tinnitus manifesting as phantom sounds, the building's old radiator system creating acoustic illusions. But logic felt thin against the precision of what I was experiencing, the exact timing, the consistent location, the deliberate nature of each roll. I pulled up the building's forum on my phone and scrolled through recent posts. Mrs. Chen on the 3rd floor complaining about water pressure, someone selling a bicycle, a neighbor asking about package delivery protocols, nothing about strange sounds or building-wide audio phenomena. At 3:15 a.m., I tried an experiment. I kept the audio software closed and placed my phone on the desk, recording. The marbles rolled on schedule, but when I played back the recording, I heard only the ambient hum of my equipment and the faint whistle of wind through the window frame's imperfect seal. The absence of evidence should have been reassuring. Instead, it felt like confirmation of something far worse. I returned to work with grim determination, opening file after file, making minute adjustments to frequency curves and ambient layers. Each time I closed the software, the rolling resumed. Each time I opened it, blessed silence. The correlation was perfect, mechanical, like a response programmed into the very fabric of my workspace. By 4 a.m., I'd developed a theory that felt both rational and utterly insane. Sound was my profession. I understood frequencies, wavelengths, the way audio could trick the human ear. Perhaps the specific electromagnetic signature of my audio software was interfering with some component in my setup, creating an acoustic phantom. A standing wave bouncing between my monitors and the wall. Resonance in the desk's wood grain activated by the software's processing load. I spent 20 minutes checking every cable connection, every piece of equipment. I moved my laptop to the kitchen table and opened the audio software there. No rolling. I brought it back to my desk and tried again. The pattern resumed immediately. Software closed. Marbles rolled. The kitchen test should have been reassuring, but it only deepened my unease. Whatever was happening was specific to this space, this configuration of equipment and furniture, or specific to me, in this chair, at this desk, during these particular hours when the building held its breath and the city outside felt like a distant memory. I tried to lose myself in work, but concentration became impossible. Every time I exported a file and the software automatically closed, the rolling began. Sometimes it was a single marble making a languid journey from one side to the other. Other times it sounded like a handful dropped simultaneously, each finding its own path across the wooden surface. The sounds began to develop personality. One marble, I started thinking of it as the scout, always rolled first, testing the path. Another followed in quick succession, eager and impatient. A third took its time, rolling so slowly I could track its progress inch by inch. They never collided, never interfered with each other's trajectories, as if following predetermined routes marked by invisible channels. At 5:30 a.m., I realized I hadn't made any meaningful progress on the audio files in over 2 hours. I'd been sitting motionless, listening to the marbles' performance, trying to decode their pattern. The discovery horrified me. I was becoming an audience to something that shouldn't exist, finding meaning in sounds that left no trace. I forced myself to focus, opening 3 files simultaneously and working on them in rapid succession. The technique kept the software active longer, extending the periods of silence. But my productivity suffered as I rushed through edits, making changes without the careful listening that good audio work required. The first hint of dawn appeared at the window's edge, a pale suggestion of light that made my apartment feel less like a sealed chamber. I'd been working for 9 hours straight, and my body ached from maintaining the same position. But I was afraid to leave my desk, afraid of what might happen if I broke the routine I'd established. At 6 a.m., I made a mistake. While adjusting a complex reverb chain, I accidentally closed the audio software without saving. The marbles began their rolling immediately, but this time something was different. The sounds came from above my head. I looked up at the ceiling, smooth drywall with no visible cracks or imperfections. But the rolling was definitely overhead, as if marbles were traversing the floor of the apartment above mine. I knew that apartment. Mrs. Kowalski, an elderly woman who'd lived there for 15 years. She kept a garden on the building's roof and brought homemade cookies to new residents. The idea of her dropping marbles at 6 a.m. was absurd, but the sound was unmistakable. Multiple marbles rolling across a hard surface, directly above my workstation. The same deliberate pace, the same glass-on-wood timbre, but displaced vertically by exactly 1 floor. I opened the audio software quickly, and the ceiling rolling stopped. But now I could hear it coming from below, muffled by carpet and floorboards, but definitely there. The marbles had migrated to the apartment beneath mine, continuing their performance in the space that mirrored my own. My mouth went dry. The building was 7 stories tall. If the marbles could move between floors. I spent the next hour opening and closing the software while listening carefully to the walls around me. The sounds migrated systematically. Ceiling, floor, left wall, right wall, cycling through my apartment's boundaries like a systematic search. Always the same marbles, always the same rolling pattern, but displaced to different planes of my enclosed space. By 7 a.m., sunlight filled my apartment with mundane detail. My coffee mug with its ring stains, the dust motes dancing in the window's light beam. The normalcy felt aggressive, as if the daylight was actively erasing the night's events. but I could still hear the marbles rolling somewhere in the building's structure, muffled but persistent. I saved my work and closed the audio software one final time. The rolling began immediately, but now it seemed to come from everywhere at once. Above, below, within the walls themselves. The building had become a resonance chamber, and I was sitting at its exact center. My phone buzzed with a text from the game's producer, asking about my progress. I typed a response about technical delays and creative challenges, my fingers steady despite what I was hearing. The marbles continued their rolling, and I realized I'd stopped trying to locate their source. They'd become part of my workspace's ambient sound, as familiar as the fan noise or the traffic below. The sun climbed higher, and my neighbors began their morning routines. Showers running, coffee makers gurgling, footsteps in the hallway. Normal sounds that should have masked the marbles, but somehow didn't. The rolling continued underneath it all, a persistent bass note that only I could hear. I understood now that the correlation with my audio software wasn't the end of the mystery. It was just the beginning. Something in my workspace had learned to respond to my work patterns, to anticipate my software usage, to move through the building's structure like sound through an instrument, or I was losing my mind with mathematical precision. I looked at my computer screen, where 17 audio files waited for editing. The deadline was tomorrow. I had a choice to make: abandon my work and seek help for what might be a serious psychological episode, or continue working and accept the marbles as part of my creative process. I opened the first file, and silence settled over my apartment like a held breath. But in that silence, I could feel something waiting. Patient, ready to resume its rolling the moment I finished my work. My fingers found the keyboard and I began to edit. Somewhere in the building's bones, the marbles waited their turn. And for the first time since this began, I wasn't entirely sure I wanted them to stop. Story 11. The morphine had worn off 3 hours ago, leaving me suspended in that peculiar limbo between sleep and consciousness that recovery demands. My abdomen throbbed with each breath, the surgical incision pulling tight against the gauze beneath my pajamas. The digital clock on my nightstand glowed an accusatory 5:53 a.m., its red numerals boring into my retinas like twin embers in the pre-dawn darkness. That's when I heard them. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, ascending the staircase that connected my half of the duplex to the vacant unit above. Each footfall landed with the weight of someone trying not to be heard, yet unable to avoid the telltale creaks of the old wooden steps. The sound drifted through the thin walls with crystalline clarity, as if the person, or thing, making them wanted to be noticed. I held my breath, counting the steps. 1, 2, 3. The rhythm was hypnotic, almost ceremonial, each footfall separated by exactly 3 seconds of silence. My heart hammered against my ribs, sending fresh waves of pain through my healing incision. The unit upstairs had been empty for 6 months. Mrs. Chen, the landlord, had mentioned it during one of her perfunctory check-ins after my surgery. No showing scheduled, she'd said. The previous tenant had left suddenly, abandoning most of his belongings. Something about a family emergency that required immediate relocation. 4, 5, 6. I forced myself to sit up, wincing as the movement stretched my stitches. The footsteps continued their measured ascent, and I found myself unconsciously matching my breathing to their rhythm. The pain medication had left my thoughts sluggish, wrapped in cotton, but fear has a way of sharpening even the most drug-addled mind. 7, 8, 9. The footsteps paused. In the silence that followed, I became acutely aware of every sound in the house. The electric hum of the refrigerator downstairs, the tick of my bedside clock, the whisper of my own labored breathing. The pause stretched on, and I began to wonder if I'd imagined the whole thing. Post-surgical hallucinations weren't uncommon, according to the discharge papers I'd barely glanced at. Then, at exactly 5:55 a.m., the footsteps resumed. 10, 11, 12, and then nothing. I waited, muscles tensed, for the 13th step that never came. The silence that followed felt pregnant with possibility, as if the very air was holding its breath. My rational mind supplied explanations: settling wood, temperature changes, the building's old bones adjusting to the approaching dawn. But my gut, that primitive part of the brain that evolution hadn't quite managed to civilize, whispered darker possibilities. 20 minutes passed before I worked up the courage to investigate. The stairs were steep and narrow, built in an era when people were smaller and less concerned with accessibility. I gripped the handrail with white knuckles, taking each step slowly to avoid aggravating my incision. The wood creaked under my weight, producing sounds remarkably similar to what I'd heard earlier. Perhaps that was all it had been: the house settling, my fevered imagination supplying the human element. I almost convinced myself of this until I reached the landing and saw the footprints. They were subtle at first, barely visible in the dim light filtering through the small window at the top of the stairs. But as my eyes adjusted, they became unmistakable. The faint outline of shoe soles, marked in what appeared to be white powder. The prints started at the bottom of the staircase and climbed steadily upward, each one perfectly formed and evenly spaced. My blood ran cold as I recognized the substance: surgical powder, the same sterile, talc-like material that had coated the gloves of my surgeon, that had dusted my hospital gown, that still clung to the corners of my discharge paperwork like ghostly fingerprints. I counted the prints twice, my fingers trembling as I traced their path. 12 distinct impressions, each one slightly fainter than the last, as if whoever, or whatever had made them, was gradually becoming less substantial with each step. The final print rested precisely on the 12th step, and beyond it, nothing. The 13th step was pristine, its dark wood surface unmarked by even a speck of dust. I knelt beside the prints, ignoring the screaming protest from my abdomen. The powder felt familiar between my fingers, bringing back sense memories of fluorescent hospital corridors and the antiseptic smell of operating rooms. But there was something else, something underneath the clinical sterility that made my stomach churn. A smell like copper pennies and stagnant air, like something that had been sealed away for too long. The logical part of my mind scrambled for explanations. Perhaps the previous tenant had worked in a hospital. Maybe I'd tracked the powder here myself somehow, during one of my post-operative visits. But I knew these theories were tissue-thin, desperate attempts to impose order on something that defied rational explanation. I returned to my bedroom but couldn't sleep. Every creak of the settling house sounded like footsteps. Every shadow seemed to shift and writhe in my peripheral vision. The surgical pain that had been my constant companion since the operation now felt like a gateway, a weakness in my defenses that something could exploit. The next morning brought no relief. In the harsh light of day, the footprints were still there, though they seemed fainter somehow, as if they were slowly being absorbed by the wood itself. I called Mrs. Chen, trying to keep my voice steady as I asked about the building's history. Had there been any unusual incidents? Any complaints from previous tenants? Her response chilled me more than the silence of the empty unit above. The previous tenant, she admitted reluctantly, had been a surgical technician at the local hospital. He'd lived here for 3 years before leaving suddenly, claiming that the building was making him sick. Other tenants had complained too, she said. Always about sounds at night, always about the feeling of being watched. But the detail that made my hands shake was the timing. Every complaint had mentioned the same specific time, 5:55 a.m. I began documenting everything. The footsteps came every night at exactly the same time, following the same pattern. 12 steps, then silence. The powder prints appeared fresh each morning, always stopping at the same place, always accompanied by that underlying smell of copper and decay. Sleep became elusive. I found myself lying awake each night, waiting for 5:55, my body tensed for the sound of those deliberate footfalls. The morphine they'd prescribed for my recovery sat untouched on my nightstand. I needed my mind clear, my senses sharp. Something was happening here, something that required my full attention. On the 5th night, I decided to wait at the bottom of the stairs. I positioned myself in the small hallway at 550, armed with nothing but a flashlight and a growing sense of dread. The house felt different in the pre-dawn darkness, as if it were holding its breath in anticipation. The very air seemed thick, resistant to movement. At exactly 5:55, the footsteps began. But this time, I saw nothing. No figure on the stairs, no shadow moving upward. Just the sounds, distinct, unmistakable, impossible to dismiss as imagination. The steps creaked under invisible weight, and I watched in fascination and terror as the powder prints appeared, one by one, as if being pressed into existence by unseen feet. The temperature plummeted with each ascending step. My breath began to mist, and frost started forming on the handrail, despite the mild autumn weather outside. The smell intensified too, that metallic organic odor that reminded me increasingly of the operating room where they'd cut me open, where they'd violated the integrity of my body with steel and sutures. By the time the invisible climber reached the 12th step, I could barely breathe. The cold was so intense that my surgical incision had begun to ache with a deep, bone-penetrating pain that no amount of medication could touch. Ice crystals formed on my eyelashes, and my flashlight beam seemed to bend and waver in the frigid air. Then, as always, the footsteps stopped. But this time, something else happened. As I stood there in the glacial silence, I became aware of a presence on the 13th step. Not visible, not audible, but undeniably there. Something was looking down at me from that unmarked wooden surface, studying me with an attention so intense it felt like being dissected. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. This thing, whatever it was, wasn't just climbing the stairs. It was climbing toward something, or someone. And tonight, for the first time, I was there to meet it. The presence on the 13th step seemed to lean forward, and I felt its attention focus on me like a surgical lamp. In that moment, I understood that my surgery hadn't just repaired my body. It had opened something else. A door, perhaps. A vulnerability. The scar on my abdomen began to burn with cold fire, as if whatever stood above me was recognizing a kinship, a shared violation of flesh and bone. The surgical powder that marked its passage wasn't just residue from the hospital, it was a calling card, a signature left by something that understood intimately the process of being opened, examined, and sutured closed. My vision began to blur, whether from the cold or something else entirely I couldn't tell. The edges of my consciousness started to fray, and I found myself wondering if this was how the previous tenant had felt in his final nights here. If this crushing, invasive presence was what had driven him away into the darkness, leaving behind only the ghostly impression of his desperate flight. The thing on the 13th step began to descend. I felt rather than heard its approach, each step sending waves of Arctic air washing over me. The surgical powder prints appeared in reverse order, marking its descent with increasing clarity. 12, 11, 10. Each footfall brought the presence closer, and with it came the growing certainty that this encounter would change me in ways I couldn't yet comprehend. My incision burned like molten ice, and I realized with dawning horror that the pain wasn't just psychosomatic. Something was happening to my scar, something that felt like being slowly unstitched by invisible fingers. The sensation was simultaneously agonizing and strangely familiar, as if my body remembered this violation from somewhere deeper than conscious memory. 9, 8, 7. The thing was almost upon me now, its presence so overwhelming that I could taste copper on my tongue and feel the phantom touch of surgical gloves against my skin. The boundary between my healing flesh and the cold presence had begun to blur, and I wondered if this was how possession began. Not with dramatic manifestations, but with the slow dissolution of the barriers between self and other. 6, 5, 4. I tried to move, to flee back to the imagined safety of my bedroom, but my legs refused to obey. I was frozen in place, a specimen pinned for examination, while something ancient and surgical prepared to complete whatever operation had begun on that sterile table weeks ago. 3, 2. The presence paused on the second step, so close now that I could feel its attention like physical pressure against my healing wound. In that moment of suspension, I understood that I had a choice to make. I could close my eyes, deny what was happening, and hope that morning would dissolve this nightmare into the comfortable realm of post-surgical hallucination. Or I could look. I chose to look. The last thing I remember clearly is the sensation of being very gently, very precisely, opened once again. Not my flesh, something deeper, more fundamental. The part of me that had always been sealed away from the world's prying instruments was finally being examined by something that understood the art of surgical violation in ways no human physician ever could. When I woke, I was lying at the bottom of the stairs. The sun was streaming through the window above, and the house was warm and ordinary and completely silent. My incision had healed perfectly overnight. No trace of the burning cold remained. No evidence of the supernatural surgery I'd experienced. But the powder prints were still there, leading up to the 13th step that remained forever unmarked. I never heard the footsteps again. The thing that climbed those stairs each night at 5:55 had found what it was looking for, had completed whatever operation it had begun. I should have felt relief. But instead, I felt a growing sense of incompleteness, as if something essential had been removed during that final encounter. The previous tenant's belongings were still in the basement storage area, Mrs. Chen told me when I finally worked up the courage to ask. Medical textbooks, surgical instruments, hospital scrubs dusted with the same white powder that marked the stairs. And among them, a journal filled with increasingly erratic handwriting that detailed the same experiences I'd had, the same nightly visitations. The final entry was dated the day before he'd disappeared. It's finished with me now. Moving on to the next one. Always moving on to the next one. The surgery is never really complete. They just stitch us closed and send us home, pretending the violation is over. But it never is. Something always remains open, waiting. I still live in the duplex. I still wake sometimes at 5:55, listening for footsteps that no longer come. But sometimes, in the moment between sleep and waking, I feel phantom hands examining something deep inside me that was never quite put back the way it should have been. And I know that someday, when the next tenant moves into the unit below, I'll understand my role in this endless cycle of surgical violation. I'll know why the footsteps always stop at the 13th step, and why there's always someone waiting there, forever caught between healing and being opened once again. The operation, after all, is never really finished. Story 12. The microwave's steel surface caught my reflection as I reached for the door handle, and for a split second, I wasn't alone. I'd been living in the converted loft for 3 months, ever since the divorce papers were finalized, and I needed somewhere that felt nothing like the suburban prison Miranda and I had shared for 8 years. The industrial space suited me. Exposed brick walls, polished concrete floors, and floor-to-ceiling windows that let in harsh geometric slashes of light during the day. Everything clean, angular, uncompromising. Everything the opposite of the floral wallpaper and doily-infested nightmare I'd escaped. The kitchen occupied one corner of the open space, a sleek island of stainless steel appliances that reflected the loft's minimalist aesthetic. The microwave sat at eye level, built into a cabinet that housed my sparse collection of dishes and the bottle of bourbon I'd been working through with increasing frequency since the move. I heated my dinner, some frozen monstrosity that promised to be pad thai but tasted like salted cardboard, and closed the microwave door. That's when I saw her, or thought I saw her. A shadow, definitely feminine in its curves and posture, stood behind my own reflection in the polished steel surface. She was tall, slender, with long hair that seemed to move independently of any breeze. Most unsettling was her raised hand, palm facing outward, fingers spread in what could have been a greeting or a warning to stay quiet. I spun around, my heart hammering against my ribs like a caged bird. The loft stretched out behind me, empty save for my sparse furniture and the dust motes dancing in the late afternoon light streaming through the windows. No one. Nothing. When I turned back to the microwave, my own reflection stared back at me, pale and slightly wild-eyed, but utterly alone. The microwave beeped, and I jumped as if someone had fired a gun beside my ear. I convinced myself it was fatigue. The architectural firm had been pushing us hard on the Meridian Tower project, and I'd been pulling 16-hour days trying to perfect the facade design. Stress could do funny things to a person's perception, create shadows where none existed, manufacture threats from the interplay of light and exhaustion. But that night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the image of that raised hand. The gesture felt deliberate, purposeful. Not a wave, but a command. Shh. The next morning, I approached the microwave with the kind of careful deliberation I usually reserved for examining structural blueprints. I heated my coffee, black, bitter, necessary, and watched my reflection in the steel surface as the machine hummed to life. Just me, looking haggard and suspicious of my own kitchen appliances. I closed the door. There she was again. This time she stood closer to my reflection, her shadow overlapping mine in a way that made my skin crawl. The raised hand remained, but now I could see more detail in the steel's distorted surface. She wore what looked like a dress or nightgown, something that flowed and shifted even though she stood perfectly still. Her face remained obscured, a dark oval beneath the fall of her hair. I held my breath, afraid that even the smallest movement would make her disappear. Or worse, make her do something else. The coffee maker gurgled behind me, and when I glanced toward the sound and back again, she was gone. My reflection stood alone, clutching the microwave handle with white knuckles. This time, I searched the loft methodically. I checked every corner, every shadow, every possible hiding place. I examined the windows for some external source that might cast a shadow at precisely the right angle to create the illusion. I called the building Super, a grizzled man named Rodriguez, and asked about the loft's history. He shrugged and told me it had been empty for 2 years before I moved in. The previous tenant was an artist, a woman who kept to herself. She'd left suddenly, abandoned most of her belongings, and never came back for them. When I pressed for details, Rodriguez just said she'd seemed troubled toward the end, claimed she wasn't sleeping, kept calling about noises in the walls, shadows that didn't belong. The building management had assumed she was having some kind of breakdown. The information should have been comforting, a rational explanation for what I was experiencing. Shared delusion, psychological suggestion, something. Instead, it made the hair on my arms stand up. That evening, I avoided the kitchen entirely. I ordered takeout and ate it on the couch, my back to the steel surfaces that might show me things I didn't want to see. But I could feel the microwave behind me like a presence, drawing my attention with the persistence of an itch I couldn't scratch. Around midnight, I gave in. The loft was dark except for the city lights filtering through the windows, casting everything in shades of blue and silver. The microwave's steel surface looked like a portal in the darkness, reflecting nothing but shadow. I didn't turn on any lights. Some instinct told me that would ruin whatever was happening, break the connection between my world and wherever she existed. I heated a cup of water. For tea, I told myself, though I had no intention of drinking it. The microwave's interior light cast a warm glow across my face as the machine hummed to life. When it finished, I reached for the door handle with a hand that trembled despite my efforts to control it. I closed the door. She was there immediately, no gradual materialization this time, and she was much closer. Her shadow pressed against the steel surface as if it were a window she was trying to look through. The raised hand remained, but now I could see her other arm hanging at her side, fingers curled into a loose fist. Her hair obscured her face completely, a dark curtain that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. I wanted to step back, to run, to turn on every light in the loft and banish her to whatever realm shadows inhabited when they weren't terrorizing exhausted architects. But something kept me frozen in place, staring into that distorted reflection. She tilted her head, a gesture so human and familiar that my chest tightened with unexpected recognition. Miranda used to tilt her head exactly like that when she was listening to something, trying to understand. But this wasn't Miranda. Miranda was alive and well, and living in our old house with her yoga instructor boyfriend and their organic vegetable garden. This was something else, something that lived in reflections and steel surfaces and the space between what was real and what was possible. The woman, shadow, hallucination, whatever she was, took a step forward. The steel surface rippled like water, and I stumbled backward, my hip catching the edge of the kitchen island. Pain shot through my side, sharp and immediate and completely, reassuringly real. When I looked back at the microwave, she was gone. But the steel surface continued to ripple, waves of distortion spreading outward from the center like stones dropped in still water. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the couch with every light in the loft blazing, watching the kitchen for any sign of movement, any suggestion that the laws of physics had decided to take another holiday. The microwave sat silent and innocent, just an appliance, just steel and circuits and the lingering smell of reheated pad thai. But I knew she was in there, waiting. The next day, I called in sick to work for the first time in 3 years. I spent the morning researching the building's history, the previous tenant, anything that might explain what was happening to me. The internet yielded frustratingly little information. The artist who'd lived here before me was named Elena Vasquez. She'd been a painter, specializing in portraits that were described as haunting and psychologically complex. She'd shown her work in a few small galleries around the city before disappearing from the art scene entirely. I found one image of her work online, a self-portrait that made my blood run cold. The painting showed a woman with long dark hair obscuring most of her face, one hand raised as if to ward off the viewer. Behind her, multiple reflections of herself appeared in what looked like mirrors or windows, each one slightly different, slightly more distorted. The gallery's description mentioned that Elena had been fascinated by the concept of parallel selves, the idea that reflections might show not just what we are, but what we could become, or what we'd left behind. She'd painted herself into the shadows. That afternoon I tried to work on the Meridian Tower designs, but my hands shook too badly to hold a pencil steady. The geometric lines that usually brought me comfort now seemed ominous, suggesting shapes that shouldn't exist, angles that bent reality in uncomfortable directions. I found myself watching the microwave from across the loft, waiting for some sign of movement in its steel surface. The rational part of my mind insisted that I was having some kind of nervous breakdown, that the stress of the divorce and the new job and the isolation had finally caught up with me. But the deeper, more primitive part of my brain whispered that something was very wrong with this place, that Elena Vasquez had left more than just abandoned paintings behind. As evening approached, I made a decision. I would confront whatever was happening, meet it head-on instead of cowering in ignorance. If I was losing my mind, at least I'd go down swinging. If something supernatural was actually occurring, I needed to understand what it wanted. I waited until the loft was dark again, then approached the microwave with the kind of grim determination I imagined soldiers felt walking into battle. I heated another cup of water, watching my reflection in the steel surface. Just me, looking like I'd aged 5 years in the past 3 days. I closed the door. She was waiting. This time, she stood directly in front of my reflection, her shadow overlapping mine so completely that I couldn't tell where I ended, and she began. Her raised hand pressed against the steel surface from the inside, and I could swear I felt the faint vibration of impact through the appliance. Tap, tap, tap. 3 soft knocks, barely audible above the humming of the refrigerator. I raised my own hand, mirroring her gesture, and pressed my palm against the steel surface. For a moment, it felt like touching warm glass with someone on the other side. Then the steel began to warm under my palm, growing hot enough to be uncomfortable, then painful. I jerked my hand away and she stepped back in perfect synchronization. That's when I saw her face. The hair had fallen away, revealing features that were both familiar and impossible. She looked like Elena Vasquez, but wrong somehow, as if someone had tried to paint a portrait from memory and gotten the proportions slightly off. Her eyes were too large, her mouth too wide, her skin the color of old silver. But underneath the wrongness, I recognized something else. The expression of desperate hope, of someone who'd been trying to communicate for a very long time, and had finally found someone who could see her. She mouthed something, words I couldn't hear but somehow understood. Help me. I stepped closer to the microwave, my breath fogging the steel surface. She pressed both hands against the inside now, her mouth moving frantically, forming words that hung in the space between us like smoke. I can't get out. The temperature in the loft dropped so suddenly that I could see my breath. Frost began forming around the edges of the microwave's door, creeping across the steel surface like living ice. Elena's image became sharper, more defined, as if the cold was somehow making the barrier between us thinner. She trapped me here. I wanted to ask who, what she meant, but my throat felt frozen shut. Elena's eyes widened with urgency, and she pressed her face close to the steel surface. She's coming back. The lights in the loft flickered once, twice, then went out completely. In the darkness, the microwave's steel surface glowed with a faint phosphorescent light that had nothing to do with electricity or technology. Elena's face floated in that eerie glow like a moon in an alien sky. Behind me, I heard the sound of footsteps on the concrete floor, slow, deliberate steps that echoed in the vast space of the loft. But when I tried to turn around, I found that I couldn't move. My muscles had locked in place, frozen by a terror so primal that it bypassed all rational thought. The footsteps stopped directly behind me. I felt breath on the back of my neck, warm and humid and carrying the scent of oil paints and turpentine. A hand settled on my shoulder, fingers long and cold even through my shirt. In the microwave's glowing surface, Elena's expression changed from desperate hope to abject terror. She shook her head frantically, her mouth forming a single word over and over. Run. But I couldn't run. I couldn't move. I could only stand there as the hand on my shoulder tightened its grip, and something that definitely wasn't Elena whispered in my ear. The voice was my own. She's not the only one who can paint people into shadows. The microwave's glow began to fade, taking Elena's terrified face with it. The hand on my shoulder guided me forward, and I watched my own reflection approach the steel surface, my eyes wide with the same desperate hope I'd seen in Elena's face. The lights flickered back on, flooding the loft with harsh, unforgiving illumination. I stood alone in the kitchen, one hand pressed against the microwave's door, my reflection staring back at me from the steel surface. But for just a moment, before the image solidified into simple, mundane reality, I could swear I saw a third figure standing behind both of us. Tall, elegant, with an artist's hands and a smile that held no warmth whatsoever. I pulled my hand away from the microwave and stumbled backward, my heart hammering so hard I was sure it would burst. The steel surface showed only my own reflection now, pale and shaking and utterly alone. But sometimes, late at night when the loft is dark and the city sleeps around me, I heat something in the microwave just to see what appears in its steel surface. Sometimes it's just me. Sometimes it's Elena with her desperate, pleading eyes. And sometimes, if I look very carefully at the shadows behind our reflections, I can see her watching us both. The artist who painted people into spaces they couldn't escape, who collected souls in steel surfaces like butterflies pinned to boards. I've stopped trying to help Elena. I've learned that some prisons are meant to keep things in, not out. But I can't leave the loft either. Every time I try to pack, every time I consider moving somewhere else, I catch my reflection in the microwave and see how much paler I've become, how much more translucent. I'm beginning to understand what Elena meant when she said she couldn't get out. The artist is very patient. She has all the time in the world to perfect her collection, to add new subjects to her gallery of shadows and steel. And every night as I stand in front of that microwave watching my reflection fade a little more, I wonder if Miranda ever notices that the photos on her social media don't quite capture her face the way they used to. If her yoga instructor boyfriend ever mentions that her shadow seems wrong somehow, disconnected from her movements. If she ever looks in a mirror and sees someone standing behind her, smiling with an artist's pride at another masterpiece completed. The microwave beeps, pulling me back to the present. My dinner is ready, though I've lost my appetite completely. I reach for the door handle and 3 reflections reach back. Story 13. The desert doesn't lie, but it doesn't tell the truth either. I've been operating heavy machinery for 15 years, and I know the difference between a mechanical malfunction and something that shouldn't exist. What's been happening in this godforsaken stretch of Syrian sand defies both categories. My name is Marcus Chen, and I'm writing this in my logbook because protocol demands documentation of all anomalous events. What I'm documenting shouldn't be possible. The winds started 3 days ago, not outside, inside. Inside my hermetically sealed, climate-controlled crane cabin, 40 feet above the scorched earth where nothing grows and nothing should move, except the convoys rolling past every 6 hours. The first time it happened, I thought the air conditioning had malfunctioned. A sudden chill swept through the cabin, sharp enough to raise goosebumps on my arms despite the external temperature reading 118 degrees Fahrenheit. The cold carried the metallic taste of winter storms, completely alien in this place where rain is a myth and snow exists only in the fevered dreams of heat-stroked soldiers. I radioed base about the AC issue. Maintenance told me all systems were running normally, suggested I hydrate more. Standard operating procedure for complaints from crane operators who spend 10 hours a day baking in steel boxes under the relentless Middle Eastern sun. But the winds weren't coming from the vents. They seemed to originate from nowhere and everywhere simultaneously, sweeping through the sealed cabin like invisible fingers, searching for something. The air moved with purpose, carrying scents that belonged in another hemisphere. Pine needles, wet earth, the ozone smell that precedes a thunderstorm, impossible scents in a place where the last tree died decades ago, and clouds or rumors painted across a merciless blue sky. The compass started acting up during the second occurrence. Standard magnetic compass, nothing fancy, mounted on my control panel for basic orientation when the GPS goes down, which it does frequently, thanks to whatever electromagnetic interference the military won't discuss. Usually it points steadily north, occasionally wavering a degree or two when heavy vehicles pass beneath. Yesterday, when the phantom winds began their Arctic dance through my cabin, the needle swung violently westward and stayed there, trembling like a living thing caught in a trap. I tapped the glass, shook the mount, even held a wrench near it to test for magnetic interference. Nothing changed its mind. The needle remained locked on west, pointing toward empty desert that stretched unbroken to the horizon. West, where intelligence reports show no structures, no installations, no roads, no life of any kind. Just sand and rock formations that satellite imagery reveals as nothing more than geological accident. But the compass insists something waits there. During last night's third incident, I began paying closer attention to the wind's behavior. It doesn't blow continuously like natural air currents. Instead, it moves in patterns, circling the cabin's interior like a predator, testing the boundaries of a cage, pausing in corners as if listening, then resuming its restless circulation. The temperature drops exactly 13 degrees each time, a detail I've verified with 3 separate thermometers. The sounds it carries are worse than the impossible cold, whispers. Too faint to understand but clear enough to recognize as human voices. Multiple voices, overlapping in what might be conversation or might be argument. Sometimes I catch fragments that almost resolve into words before dissolving back into sibilant noise. The languages sound familiar but foreign, like hearing English spoken backward or Arabic filtered through water. I've tried recording the phenomena. My phone captures nothing but ambient cabin noise. The official monitoring equipment in my crane detects no temperature fluctuations, no air movement, no electromagnetic anomalies. According to every instrument except my own senses, nothing unusual is occurring. This morning I discovered I'm not the only one experiencing something strange. Rodriguez, who operates the crane on the adjacent construction site, mentioned feeling weird drafts in his cabin. We compared notes during the lunch break, speaking in the careful, measured tones men use when they suspect they might be losing their minds. His descriptions matched mine exactly. The Arctic temperatures, the purposeful movement of air, the compass deviation. But his compass points southeast, toward a different empty stretch of desert. We haven't told anyone else. Military psychologists have very specific procedures for dealing with equipment operators who report impossible phenomena, and those procedures generally involve immediate rotation back to base for extended evaluation. Neither of us can afford that kind of attention on our service records. Instead, we've decided to conduct our own investigation. The plan is simple. Tomorrow, during the evening shift when most personnel are at chow, we'll coordinate our observations. When the winds begin, and they will begin, they always start precisely at 1847 hours. We'll note every detail, cross-reference our compass readings, and attempt to triangulate whatever force is affecting our equipment. The rational part of my mind insists this is some kind of natural phenomenon we don't understand, possibly related to the unusual geological formations in this region, or underground military installations we're not cleared to know about. Desert environments play tricks on perception. Heat exhaustion causes hallucinations. Stress manifests in physical symptoms, but rationality doesn't explain why the winds only occur inside our sealed cabins. It doesn't account for the whispered conversations in languages that sound like echoes of something once familiar. It doesn't address the way my compass needle trembles with what appears to be fear. And it certainly doesn't explain what I saw this afternoon. While the phantom winds circled my cabin, carrying their cargo of impossible winter and foreign whispers, I happened to glance toward the western horizon, where my compass insists something waits. The heat shimmer that normally distorts distant vision was absent, leaving the landscape stark and clear under the brutal afternoon sun. Something moved out there. Not vehicles. I know the silhouettes of every piece of equipment in this theater. Not personnel. No human figure could be visible at that distance. Something larger, darker, moving with deliberate purpose across the empty desert toward our position. When I looked through my binoculars, the western horizon appeared normal, vacant sand stretching to infinity, broken only by the occasional rock outcropping. But when I lowered the binoculars, the movement resumed, just at the edge of vision where the eye catches motion without being able to focus on specific details. I radioed Rodriguez. He confirmed seeing similar movement to the southeast, in the direction his compass indicates. 2 operators, 2 different compass bearings, 2 separate areas of movement in regions intelligence assures us are completely uninhabited. The winds are growing stronger. What began as gentle circulation through my cabin has intensified into aggressive gusts that rattle loose equipment and send papers flying despite the complete absence of any air circulation from the ventilation system. The cold has deepened to the point where I can see my breath, and frost forms on the interior windows. Frost, in a desert where water vapor is so scarce that humidity readings barely register above 0. The whispers have evolved into something approaching conversation, multiple voices engaged in what sounds like urgent discussion. I've started recognizing recurring sound patterns that might be repeated words or phrases, but the language remains tantalizingly beyond comprehension. Sometimes the voices pause, and in those moments of silence, I have the distinct impression they're listening to something, or waiting for something. The waiting feels directed at me. Tonight, Rodriguez and I will execute our plan. We've synchronized our watches, prepared detailed observation forms, and established communication protocols that don't rely on standard radio channels. Whatever's happening here, we're going to document it properly and figure out what force is affecting our equipment. I keep telling myself it's equipment malfunction, environmental factors, psychological stress, manifesting as shared delusion. Military life in hostile environments creates strange psychological bonds between personnel, makes them susceptible to collective hallucinations and groupthink. But equipment malfunction doesn't explain why the winds carry the scent of snow when the nearest snowfall is 2,000 miles away. Environmental factors don't account for whispered conversations in my sealed cabin. Psychological stress doesn't make compasses point toward empty desert with unwavering certainty. And shared delusion doesn't explain what I found this morning. While conducting my routine equipment inspection, I discovered a thin layer of sand inside my cabin. Not the fine dust that occasionally infiltrates despite the seals. Actual sand, the coarse-grained variety found in riverbeds and lake shores, completely different from the powdery desert sand surrounding our installation. The sand was arranged in patterns, not random accumulation from mechanical vibration or air circulation, but deliberate designs, concentric circles, intersecting lines, symbols that almost resembled writing in an alphabet I couldn't identify. The patterns were too precise for coincidence, too complex for natural formation. I photographed everything before the afternoon winds began and scattered the evidence. The photographs show only empty cabin floor. Even the sand samples I collected appear as ordinary desert dust when examined outside the crane. Something is happening here that exists only within the boundaries of our equipment, only during specific times, only for certain observers. Something that leaves evidence which disappears when subjected to external verification. The horizon shows movement again, closer this time. Rodriguez reports similar observations from his position. Whatever approaches us from the empty desert is coordinating its advance, timing its movements to coincide with the phantom winds and whispered conversations that fill our isolated cabins. In 6 hours, we'll have answers, or we'll discover that the questions are far stranger than we imagined. The winds are calling now, circling my cabin with increasing urgency, and the whispers have become clear enough that I almost understand them. They're speaking English, I think, or something close enough to English that meaning hovers just beyond comprehension. They're calling my name. The compass needle points steadily west, toward whatever approaches through the empty desert, and for the first time since this began, I'm afraid to look. Because I'm starting to understand that the winds aren't coming from outside. They're coming from inside. Inside me. Inside this place. Inside something that was here long before we arrived, and will remain long after we leave. The desert remembers things that maps forget, and some of those memories are trying to return. The investigation proceeds as planned. But I'm no longer certain we're investigating a phenomenon. I think the phenomenon is investigating us. Entry ends. Compass bearing, 270 degrees magnetic. Temperature variance, 13 degrees Fahrenheit. Time, 1847 hours. The winds are singing now. Story 14. The brass key felt heavier than it should have in my palm as I stood before room 13, its painted red door adorned with a faded circus poster featuring a grinning clown whose eyes seemed to track my movement. The funny farm hostel had been the only accommodation I could afford in this forgotten corner of Oregon, and now, staring at that unsettling smile, I wondered if sleeping outdoors might have been the wiser choice. The key turned with a grinding screech that echoed down the narrow hallway lined with vintage carnival memorabilia. Inside, the room embraced me with the scent of mothballs and something else. Something sweet and cloying that reminded me of cotton candy left to rot in summer heat. A single bed dominated the cramped space, its headboard painted with chipped circus animals frozen in eternal performance. Above it hung a brass lamp with a red shade that cast everything in an amber glow. I dropped my backpack and immediately noticed the piece of paper on the pillow. It was pristine white, the kind of heavy stock you'd find in an expensive hotel, completely out of place in this rundown establishment. The message was printed in neat block letters, "Smile before the lights blink." My stomach clenched. I hadn't written this. Hell, I'd just gotten the key from the desk clerk, a thin woman with too much rouge who'd handed it over without looking up from her crossword puzzle. The note couldn't have been here when the last guest checked out, could it? The room looked like it hadn't been occupied in weeks. I turned the paper over, searching for any identifying marks, but found only that same unsettling message. As I held it up to the light, trying to make sense of its presence, the lamp beside the bed flickered once, then twice, then a third time, each blink lasting exactly 2 seconds before plunging the room into momentary darkness. The silence that followed felt thick enough to choke on. I told myself it was just old wiring. Places like this were notorious for electrical issues, but as I set the note on the nightstand, my hands were trembling slightly, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been set in motion by my simply reading those words. The hours that followed passed in uneasy restlessness. I tried to read, but the book's pages seemed to blur together. I attempted to plan the next leg of my journey, but my mind kept drifting back to that cryptic message. Every sound in the building, the creak of floorboards above, the distant hum of ancient plumbing, the whisper of wind through poorly sealed windows, seemed amplified, loaded with significance I couldn't decipher. Around midnight I heard footsteps in the hallway. They were deliberate, measured, stopping just outside my door. I held my breath, straining to listen, but heard only the steady tick of an old clock somewhere in the building's depths. When I finally worked up the courage to peer through the peephole, the corridor was empty, lit by a single fluorescent bulb that cast stark shadows between the doorways. But there, on the faded carpet directly in front of my room, lay another piece of paper. This time I didn't hesitate. I yanked the door open and snatched up the note, my eyes darting up and down the hallway for any sign of whoever had left it. The paper was identical to the first, same stock, same precise lettering. But the message had changed. The performance begins at 3:17. Performance? I checked my watch. 12:47 a.m. That gave me less than 3 hours to figure out what the hell was happening. Back in my room, I examined both notes under the lamplight, looking for fingerprints, watermarks, anything that might provide a clue about their origin. The paper felt expensive beneath my fingers, its surface smooth and unblemished. When I held them up to the light, I could see no hidden messages or identifying marks. They might as well have materialized from thin air. I tried calling the front desk, but the line rang endlessly without answer. The silence on the other end felt more ominous than a busy signal would have. For a moment, I considered packing up and leaving, but something kept me rooted in place. A mixture of curiosity and the creeping certainty that running wouldn't solve anything. Whatever was happening here had specifically chosen me, and I needed to understand why. The lamp flickered again, 3 deliberate blinks that seemed to acknowledge my decision to stay. As the minutes crawled toward 3:17, the atmosphere in the room grew increasingly oppressive. The sweet smell intensified, now carrying undertones of something medicinal, like the antiseptic scent of a hospital. The walls seemed to press closer, and I noticed details I'd missed before. The way the painted circus animals' eyes all gazed toward the bed, how the shadows cast by the lamp created the illusion of movement in the corners of my vision. At 3:10, I heard music. It drifted through the walls like smoke, a tinny carousel melody that seemed to emanate from the building's very bones. The tune was familiar, yet wrong somehow, as if played backward, or in a minor key that transformed childhood wonder into something far more sinister. I pressed my ear to the wall, trying to determine its source, but the sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. 3:15. The music grew louder, joined by what sounded like distant applause, the kind of enthusiastic clapping you'd hear at a live performance. But there was something mechanical about it, too rhythmic, too perfect, like a recording played on an endless loop. 3:16. I found myself standing in the center of the room, both notes clutched in my sweating palms, staring at the second hand of my watch as it swept toward the appointed moment. The lamp's glow seemed to pulse in time with my heartbeat, casting my shadow in multiple directions across the walls. 3:17. The lights went out completely. In the absolute darkness that followed, I heard the sound of shuffling feet, as if an entire audience was rising from their seats in unison. The applause grew thunderous, echoing from directions that shouldn't exist in a simple hostel room. I fumbled for my phone's flashlight, but when the white LED beam cut through the darkness, I saw something that made my blood freeze. The walls had changed. Where before there had been faded wallpaper and carnival posters, now stretched an enormous circus tent, its red and white stripes rising up into shadows that my light couldn't penetrate. The bed remained, but it now sat in the center of what appeared to be a performance ring, surrounded by bleachers filled with indistinct figures whose faces I couldn't quite make out in the dim glow. I blinked hard, shaking my head, certain I was hallucinating from stress or bad food. But when I opened my eyes, the scene remained unchanged. The air tasted different now, thick with sawdust and the metallic tang of fear. From somewhere high above came the sound of trapeze artists moving through the air, their equipment creaking rhythmically as they swung back and forth. A spotlight suddenly blazed to life, its beam centered directly on me. The applause died instantly, replaced by an expectant silence that pressed against my eardrums like deep water. I stood frozen in that circle of harsh white light, acutely aware that hundreds of eyes were watching my every movement. My phone's flashlight seemed pathetic now, a weak candle flame against the overwhelming darkness surrounding the performance area. That's when I noticed the figure standing just outside the spotlight's reach. It was tall and thin, dressed in a classic clown costume that had seen better days. The white face paint was cracked and yellowed, the red smile grotesquely oversized, stretching nearly to the creature's ears. But it was the eyes that held my attention. They were my eyes, exactly my eyes, staring back at me with an expression of infinite sadness. The clown raised one gloved hand and pointed at me, then at its own painted smile. The gesture was unmistakable. Smile. I felt my facial muscles contract involuntarily, pulling my lips upward in a rictus grin that felt nothing like happiness. The moment my smile formed, the audience erupted in fresh applause, their enthusiasm bordering on hysteria. The clown nodded approvingly and began to circle the ring, its oversized shoes making wet slapping sounds against the sawdust-covered ground. As it moved, I realized this wasn't just any clown. It was me, or some twisted version of me. Same height, same build, even the same scar on the left hand from a childhood accident. The only differences were the costume and that painted smile that never wavered, never showed the terror I knew was reflected in those familiar eyes. The applause gradually faded, and I heard a voice that sounded like mine but wasn't quite right, as if played through a radio with poor reception. It spoke the words I somehow knew it would say, "Welcome to the show that never ends." The spotlight dimmed slightly, and I could see more of the audience now. They were all clowns. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, each one wearing a different version of my face beneath their garish makeup. Some had exaggerated frowns, others wore expressions of surprise or confusion. But they all shared my features, my bone structure, my eyes. And they were all watching me with the hungry anticipation of predators studying their prey. The ring began to rotate slowly, like a massive lazy Susan, and I found myself moving without conscious volition. My feet remained planted firmly on the ground, but the floor beneath me turned with mechanical precision. As I spun, I caught glimpses of the different acts taking place around the ring's perimeter. To my left, a high-wire walker balanced on a rope stretched between two poles, but the figure was translucent, more suggestion than substance. Directly across from me, a lion tamer cracked a whip at empty air, his movements precise but pointless. And everywhere, always, the clowns watched and waited. The rotation stopped, and I found myself facing a funhouse mirror that had materialized from nowhere. My reflection stared back, but it was wrong in ways I couldn't immediately identify. Then I realized the mirror me was smiling that same painted smile, even though I was certain my own expression had returned to one of terror and confusion. Mirror me raised its hand and waved. I didn't wave back, but somehow my reflection did anyway. That's when I understood. This wasn't a performance I was watching. I was the performance. Every fear, every moment of confusion and terror was entertainment for this impossible audience. They fed on my distress, growing more solid and real, with each spike of adrenaline that coursed through my system. The clown that looked like me stepped forward, close enough that I could smell the grease paint and something else underneath, something that reminded me of hospitals and formaldehyde. When it spoke again, its voice was clearer now, unmistakably my own, but stripped of all warmth and humanity. "You've been such a wonderful audience," it said, addressing not me but the bleachers full of watchers. "But every show must have an encore." It pulled out a piece of paper, the same pristine white stock as the notes I'd found, and held it up for me to see. This one contained a single word: again. The spotlight began to dim, and I felt the circus tent dissolving around me like sugar in rain. The bleachers faded first, their occupants becoming transparent before disappearing entirely. The high ceiling collapsed inward, becoming flat and low once more. The sawdust underfoot transformed back into threadbare carpet, but the clown remained. It stood in my hostel room, impossible but undeniably present, still wearing my face beneath that grotesque smile. As the last of the circus atmosphere faded away, it reached into its pocket and pulled out another note. This one it placed gently on my pillow before stepping backward into the shadows cast by the brass lamp. "See you tomorrow night. it whispered, and then it was gone. I lunged for the light switch, flooding the room with harsh fluorescent illumination. Everything appeared exactly as it had when I'd first entered. The painted headboard, the old carpet, the faded wallpaper. The only evidence of what I'd experienced was the new note on my pillow. With shaking hands, I picked it up and read, "Thank you for a wonderful performance. Same time tomorrow." I checked my watch. 3:18 a.m. I should have left then. Should have grabbed my backpack and run into the night, putting as much distance as possible between myself and that cursed hostel. Instead, I found myself sitting on the edge of the bed, staring at the note and trying to process what had happened. Had I hallucinated the entire thing? Was I suffering some kind of breakdown brought on by months of solitary travel and poor nutrition? The rational part of my mind insisted that had to be the explanation. Circus tents don't appear in hostel rooms. Clowns wearing your face don't materialize from thin air. These things simply don't happen in the real world. But the note was real. I could feel its weight, smell the faint chemical scent of whatever printing process had created it. And there, on the carpet beside the bed, were traces of sawdust that definitely hadn't been there before. As dawn approached, I managed to convince myself that I'd experienced some kind of waking dream, a stress-induced hallucination that had felt real, but was ultimately just my mind playing tricks on me. The notes could be explained. Perhaps the hostel staff had some odd tradition of leaving cryptic messages for guests, a quirky marketing gimmick to play up the circus theme. I actually managed to sleep for a few hours, exhaustion finally overcoming fear. But when I woke around noon, there was a fourth note waiting. This one sat propped against the coffee maker in the small kitchenette area. Somewhere I was certain I would have noticed it earlier. The message was longer this time. "We hope you enjoyed last night's show. Your performance was magnificent. We've never had an audience member become part of the act so naturally. Tonight's show promises to be even more spectacular." My hands shook as I read it. There was no denying it now. Something was definitely happening here. Something that defied rational explanation. The question was whether I was losing my mind or if I'd stumbled into something genuinely supernatural. I spent the day trying to research the hostel but found almost nothing online. A few ancient travel reviews mentioned the circus theme, but nothing about mysterious notes or midnight performances. The building's history was similarly opaque. It had been constructed in the 1920s as a boarding house, changed hands numerous times over the decades, and had been operating as a hostel for only about 5 years. But there was one detail that made my blood run cold. In 1987, the building had briefly housed a traveling circus during the off-season. The performers had reportedly stayed for 3 months while recovering from an accident that had injured several members of the troupe. No deaths were mentioned, but the circus had disbanded shortly afterward, its members scattering to unknown destinations. As evening approached, I found myself torn between terror and curiosity. Every rational instinct screamed at me to leave, to check out and never look back. But part of me, a part that was growing stronger with each passing hour, wanted to see what would happen next. There was something intoxicating about being chosen, about being the star of whatever impossible show was taking place in room 13. At 11 p.m., I made my decision. I would stay for one more night, but this time I would be prepared. I set up my phone to record video, positioned myself where I could observe everything, and waited. The first note appeared at 11:47, slipped under my door while I watched. I saw no feet in the gap beneath the door, heard no footsteps in the hallway. The paper simply materialized as if pushed by invisible hands. This note contained a program, complete with acts and performers listed in elegant script. Tonight's featured performance, the Magnificent Mirror Act. Starring you supporting cast, the Eternal Ensemble. Showtime 3:17 a.m. Special guest appearance, the Ringmaster. The Ringmaster. My doppelganger clown hadn't mentioned anyone else, but somehow I knew this was significant. The hierarchy of whatever was happening here was becoming clearer. I was the unwitting performer, the clowns were the audience, and the Ringmaster was... what? The director? The one pulling the strings? At 3:15, my phone's camera stopped working. The screen went black, and no amount of button pressing could revive it. I wasn't particularly surprised. Whatever forces were at work here clearly didn't want their activities documented. This time, when 3:17 arrived and the lights went out, I was ready. The transformation happened more quickly than before, the circus tent materializing around me with the efficiency of a stage change during a Broadway show. But tonight felt different. The audience of clowns was larger, their attention more focused, their hunger more palpable. And there, standing on a platform that definitely hadn't been part of last night's setup, was a figure I knew had to be the ringmaster. Unlike the others, this one didn't wear my face. Instead, it was completely featureless beneath its tall black hat, as if someone had stretched skin over a skull and forgotten to add the details. When it spoke, its voice seemed to come from everywhere at once, a sound like wind through empty spaces. "Ladies and gentlemen," it announced to the assembled clowns, "tonight we witness the final transformation. Our dear performer has shown such dedication, such natural talent, that we have decided to extend a permanent invitation to join our troupe." The applause that followed was deafening, but I barely heard it over the sound of my own heartbeat. Permanent invitation. Join the troupe. The implications were clear, even if I didn't fully understand the mechanism. The spotlight found me again, but this time it felt different, warmer, more welcoming, almost alive. As its glow enveloped me, I felt a strange sense of belonging, as if I'd finally found a place where I truly fit. The fear that had dominated my thoughts for the past day began to ebb, replaced by something that might have been relief. Why had I been so afraid? This was clearly where I belonged. These were my people, my family, my audience. All those years of feeling like an outsider, of never quite fitting in anywhere I went, had led me to this moment. I'd been searching for something my entire adult life, and now I'd found it. The ringmaster descended from its platform with movements that defied gravity, floating rather than walking across the sawdust-covered ground. As it approached, I felt my facial muscles beginning to change, my expression shifting without conscious direction. My reflection in the funhouse mirror, which had reappeared in exactly the same position as the night before, showed the transformation in real time. My smile was widening, stretching far beyond what should have been anatomically possible. My eyes were becoming rounder, more expressively exaggerated, and my skin was taking on the waxy, artificial appearance of grease paint that had been applied so many times it had become permanent. "Welcome home," the ringmaster whispered as it reached me, its voice now sounding almost tender. "Welcome to the show that never ends." And in that moment, I felt nothing but joy. The circus tent began to dissolve once more, but this time I didn't feel the same sense of loss. I knew now that it would return tomorrow night, and the night after that, and every night for as long as I remained in room 13. Maybe longer. The details seemed unimportant compared to the overwhelming sense of purpose that filled me. As my hostel room materialized around me, I noticed that something fundamental had changed. The painted circus animals on the headboard were looking at me differently now, with recognition rather than the blank stare of mere decoration. The lamp's amber glow seemed warmer, more welcoming. Even the mothball smell had transformed into something sweeter, more appealing. On my pillow sat the final note, but I knew what it would say before I read it. "Congratulations on joining the family. Your room is available for as long as you need it." I'm writing this account 3 weeks later, though time has become somewhat fluid here. The performances continue every night, and each one is more spectacular than the last. I've discovered talents I never knew I possessed, an ability to contort my body in ways that shouldn't be possible, a gift for physical comedy that brings howls of laughter from my audience, a natural stage presence that makes every moment under the spotlight feel like coming alive. During the days, I venture out occasionally, but I always return by evening. Room 13 has become more than just accommodation. It's home in a way nowhere else has ever been. The front desk clerk, whose name I've learned is Meredith, always greets me with a knowing smile that suggests she understands exactly what I've become part of. Sometimes I catch glimpses of other guests in the hallway, backpackers and budget travelers like I once was. They look lost, uncertain, searching for something they can't quite name. I want to tell them that what they're looking for is here, in room 13, waiting for them to discover it. But I know they have to find it on their own, just as I did. The notes still appear, but now they feel less like mysterious messages and more like love letters from old friends. Tonight simply says, "Another magnificent show awaits." And it does. Every night the circus returns, and every night I become more myself than I've ever been. The person who checked into this hostel 3 weeks ago was just a shell, a hollow vessel searching for meaning. Now I am complete, whole, exactly where I belong. I smile as I write this, and I can see in the mirror across the room that my smile has become permanent, painted on by forces far more skilled than any makeup artist. My reflection waves at me, and this time, I wave back eagerly. The lamp beside my bed flickers 3 times, and I know it's almost time for tonight's performance. I set down my pen and prepare to take my place under the spotlight once more, where I will remain, happily, for as long as the show continues. And the show, I've learned, never ends.